Rebecca, how are we doing to get to quorum? Or are you counting?
We are at 19.
Okay.
Right, we're at 25 now. That's still quorum, right?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna start in a minute or two. Okay, why don't we get started? So thank you everybody for coming. I think what we'll do is actually hear from one of our council members, Keith Powers, first, who will just speak a little bit, and then we'll have the presentation from Annie Levers from the council, and then we'll open it up for more discussion and questions. So let's turn it over to Keith.
All right. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you, and hope you're staying safe and healthy and hopefully enjoying a little bit of nice weather before it gets a little colder again. As folks know, I'm City Council Member Keith Powers. I think we will be joined briefly by Councilmember Kalos, but his mother passed away, and I know he's dealing with that, and I'm really thinking about him. I know all of us are. So I'll happy to do a little bit of the work here tonight. I think right after this, you're going to get a presentation from Annie Levers from the City Council, who is one of our stars here, and is going to give you a great rundown of this proposal. I'll just give you a little bit of context of where the council has been thinking, what we've been thinking about. And of course, this has been a couple of, I'd say almost years of work being put in and a lot of different ideas put in. But I know that folks have a lot of questions or want to raise concerns or issues. So let me just give you a little bit of what I think the thinking was. Annie will take the rest away and tell me where I'm wrong. But essentially, I think when I got into the council, some folks have been talking about this, I think even before I got there. And the general thinking here was, how do we have a land use process and more of a planning process here in the city that allows us to have a dialogue and discussion about the needs of the city in different communities, and to think about planning and zoning, not only during the moments where we have an application right before us, because mostly right now, the two ways we do planning in this, where we do development in the city or housing or building in the city, is around as of right, or through a rezoning and a land use application that comes to the community board, the city council. And in those moments, there's always lots of tension or lots of kind of questions about whether it fits the needs of the city and fits the needs of the community at that particular time, or then in our particular moment. So as we think about challenges around affordable housing, we think about challenges about development, and kind of a city that is growing, but sort of mostly doing that through one-off sort of land use applications. There's not really ever a moment in our city where we step back and think about what is the needs of the city, what are the needs of the community at that particular time, nor are you really ever empowered here to sort of, you can do it obviously as part of your process here, but never really empowered through our land use process to do thinking about what you need outside of these sort of one-time deals. So what happens is, as you know, we often get these applications and then we have to sort of immediately assess what we think of them. We have to, they may or may not go on the clock at some point, but there's years of planning sometimes that go into an application for land use. And really, we're really up against that. So we are really trying to figure out what the challenges are, the needs are of the city and our particular community board at any particular time. But we mostly are doing that through these applications. So I think that other cities have processes that sort of look like this. They have opportunities to do a little bit more long-term planning around your community and the needs of this area or this whole city here. And that's what this is sort of meant to be. So the council have been working on this for a long time. Councilmember Kalis and I have chipped in along the way and some thoughts along with Councilmember Lander, the Speaker's office, and others to think about ways we could assess this process differently. And the council and the speaker staff not long ago had put out a report that looked at this process. If you have a lot of time in your hands, it's a very big report, you can read it. But and then we put out a bill on it. Now, like all pieces of legislation, it goes up for a hearing to assess to get public input, to hear what people think about it, to figure out where the public sentiment is on it, how it might uproot or change the existing processes. And so we've had that. We had a hearing a few weeks ago on this. The report was out, the bill is out. I'll let Annie and folks talk about what might come ahead, what may be ahead. But that's where we stand right now. I would say two things. This is all I'll say. One is, there's no perfect way to do land use in New York City. This is an attempt to sort of have a long-term vision at the same time you're doing the short-term stuff within your actual district through applications. And second is, there was a lot of thought put into it. I know that there's been a lot of dialogue with folks about how to do this, but I know there's concern about where the community boards fall on this. This is all still a process. And I think part of the reason of being here today for the Speaker's office is to have a little bit of a dialogue with folks here about what the comments, concerns, or questions are. But I just encourage you to be open-minded about thinking about land use a little differently, even if you have some concerns about the specific proposal that's before you right now. And there's a lot of opportunity here for feedback. So I'll end there. I know there's going to be a presentation, I think, coming up, but I wanted to say to Russell and the land use folks, everybody here, I appreciate you taking time because it is a good opportunity to stop and ask questions about what we're thinking about. And I want to thank Annie for being here from the Speaker's office because she's worked on this for a while and I know has also given a lot of thought and tackled these different questions. So it's a good opportunity for her to have a conversation with everyone here as well. So I'll end it there. I think I'll stick around for when there's questions. And Russell, I'll hand it back to you. But thanks everybody for being here tonight.
Thank you. So before we turn it over to Annie, I just want Will to give the Zoom spiel, which we usually do. So just if you could run through that, Will.
Yeah. So welcome to everybody. If it's your first time joining one of CB8's virtual meetings, you'll notice that you are muted and you're not able to unmute yourself. And the only people who will be unmuted throughout the meeting is the chair, Russell Squire, and our presenters as they are making presentations, Annie, and then the council members as well. Following Annie's presentation, Russell will call for members of the public who wish to speak. You can participate by going to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and pressing the raise hand icon, not the thumbs up or the wave, because those will disappear. And you only want to press it once. If you press it a second time, your hand will go back down. If you are calling in from the phone, you have to hit *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to unmute. Be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once the chair calls on you. And the chat is only for technical support to help with Zoom software problems. It's not to ask questions of the chair or the presenter. They won't see those chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you'll need to go to the participants section where you'll find the raise hand feature there. Please do not just raise your actual hand. We will probably miss you and you will not get called on. Back over to Russell.
Thank you. So we just ran through that, but we're not going to start doing questions or comments until after the presentation. I want to start with the presentation first. So with that, we will turn it over to Annie Levers.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here tonight. I really do appreciate it, and thank you to Councilmember Powers for that excellent introduction. I appreciate you being here tonight, Councilmember, and expressing support for this endeavor. I know it's a really complicated proposal, so I'm here again to lay the foundation for what I hope will be a productive conversation, to hear your feedback, hear your concerns, take all of that back. I want to underscore that you should all feel no rush in providing feedback. I'm scheduled to provide these types of presentations out through June, and I'm sure that will continue. So, we'll be having these conversations. I'll be collecting feedback for the next 2 to 3 months at least. We have no time for, no timeline for passage at this time. I will say I was a little disappointed to hear that I heard that Paul Graziano came to the Zoning and Development meeting. He does not have a very good handle on the proposal and has been pretty actively spreading misinformation about it and confusing folks. So I'm going to be spending some of the portion tonight just, correcting what he presented, providing a more accurate description of what this proposal does and does not do. And that hopefully will lay the foundation for a productive conversation where we can hear your feedback and take that and strengthen the proposal with it. So with that, I will share my screen. Oh, I'm not allowed to share my screen. Can you enable me to share my screen?
You can go ahead right now.
Thank you. All right. So with limited time, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these key issues, but will instead direct you to that report that the council member mentioned, which has a lot of great resources and research that's cited. But in short, the city's planning mandates are insufficient, they're scattered, they're confusing. This leads to inefficiencies and a lack of coordination across city agencies. Our planning regime, as the council member said, is really purely reactionary. There are very few opportunities for communities to proactively plan for their futures. Instead, we're left reacting to irresponsible development in our neighborhoods and individual rezoning proposals that are basically already fully baked by the time they get to the community board. The city often does nothing to support the creation of proactive 197A plans, forcing community boards to find funds to pay for a consultant to front the cost of environmental review and all of that analysis. And even where communities are able to find those funds and put those plans together, the city often outright ignores those plans in future rezoning decisions, even where there's a 197A plan in place. So the city's sort of piecemeal project by project approach to rezonings has exacerbated inequality. The budget is rarely, if ever, connected to our policy goals or our land use priorities in any meaningful way. And our budget decisions are almost entirely divorced from assessments of our capital needs, which are also totally insufficient. So in response to these issues, the council started working on a proposal for comprehensive planning under the direction of Speaker Johnson, really during the 2019 Charter Revision Commission. So the speaker was supportive of implementing comprehensive planning through that process. And when the commission did not take up the issue, we continued developing a version of the proposal that could be adopted by the council via local law. So the proposal that I'll describe here tonight is designed specifically to center issues of equity, access to housing, sustainability, and resilience within a full range of policy, land use, and budget tools to better achieve our citywide and neighborhood goals. It's also designed to enhance public participation in the creation of those citywide and neighborhood goals. So right now, any given mayor could come into office in 2022 and set citywide goals in line with their electoral agenda. That mayor could say we need to generate an additional 500,000 affordable housing units or 700,000, whatever it is, without any rationale for how that number was chosen or opportunity for input. This proposal would implement what every other major city in the country uses to actually set those citywide goals, which is comprehensive planning. So comp planning would start with an objective assessment of the city's existing conditions and prioritize addressing the long-standing issues we see again and again in our neighborhoods. And it would set citywide goals in partnership with other elected officials, community boards, and the members of the general public. So the first thing to note is that comprehensive planning is extremely common. New York City is really an outlier. Every other major city in the country and a lot of countries all across the world engage in some form of comprehensive planning. But for decades, New York City has repeatedly abandoned attempts to require comp planning or engage in it in any meaningful way, in favor of this sort of ad hoc approach, despite the fact that comp planning is widely accepted as best practice, especially for confronting the climate crisis and really integrating sustainability into every aspect of governance. So some might argue that the way we do things, works just fine, muddling through one project or neighborhood at a time. And while that approach may have gotten us through the last century, a piecemeal approach to combating the climate crisis is really just going to be a disaster if we continue on with this piecemeal approach to dealing with the fact that by 2100, all of our coastal neighborhoods are going to be underwater every day at high tide. So our housing and homelessness crisis is only going to get worse with climate change. 80% of the housing units in the current floodplain are affordable housing, and 28% of those units are NYCHA units. But even in the shorter term, unemployment rates are through the roof, small businesses are suffering, but we really have no clear path to create more accessible, high quality jobs for New Yorkers. And we have this backlog of capital needs that grows by billions and billions of dollars every single year as our existing infrastructure degrades. And yet we have really no rational or equitable system for prioritizing what needs to get fixed first and in which neighborhoods, let alone deciding what new infrastructure needs to get built and where. So before I jump into the details of the proposal, I want to spend a minute clearing up some facts about what the proposal does and does not do. So the bill does not make nor require any amendments or changes to the city's zoning resolution whatsoever. It does not require or trigger requirements for any kind of upzonings or setting real estate targets for development at all whatsoever. It does not propose or support the elimination of single-family zoning in New York City, which is not even a really big issue in this city, but has been spread as, again, sort of a lie about this proposal. It also does not eliminate any environmental review requirements whatsoever. That is a complete misconception. What it does require the city to produce is a generic environmental impact statement for the plan itself. So it would be like an impact statement for the Plan YC report, essentially. That would actually help measure the plan's cumulative impact. So each individual project that currently triggers environmental review would still trigger environmental review. If the project conforms with the long-term plan, then it could draw from that GEIS, but the project would still be required to produce environmental review for all of the impacts specific to that project with respect to construction, shadows, what have you. So it does not eliminate any environmental review requirements whatsoever. What it does do is require the city to provide community boards and the public with new resources, data, and analyses to support proactive community-based planning. It encourages the city to direct new growth and development away from low-lying areas vulnerable to sea level rise and other displacement risks like rising rents and real estate speculation. It identifies and prioritizes communities' urgent budget needs, regardless of whether or not those neighborhoods are going through rezoning. And then finally, it encourages fine-grained rezoning tools to be equitably distributed citywide. Where it works well in one neighborhood, we can make recommendations for applying that in more neighborhoods where the zoning is completely out of date, and gives all neighborhoods the opportunity to proactively plan. So again, as noted, all future land use applications would remain subject to ULURP. And the claim that this proposal would empower the mayor and his appointees to make sweeping land use decisions in neighborhoods citywide is kind of preposterous because the mayor already has that power right now. So today, any given mayor has the power and the resources to initiate a rezoning proposal. And again, we're stuck reacting to those rezoning proposals from the mayor or private developers. By the time it gets to us, it's often fully baked. And so this proposal really just flips the script to give communities an opportunity to inform the city and developers' plans at the front end of the process before ULURP is even considered. And then all of those projects would remain completely subject to ULURP. It just enhances elected officials and community boards' influence over future rezoning decisions by giving them a defined role in this proactive planning process. So again, let me be very clear that this proposal does not require the city to, I think it was, increase real estate development in every community board. And in fact, as you all are very aware, there is already a lot of real estate development happening in every community board every single day, but without a rational vision rooted in community input and objective data sort of guiding the city's decisions around these projects. So the comprehensive planning framework is designed to build that shared proactive vision for the city's future across community stakeholders, city agencies, elected officials, and the New Yorkers those elected officials represent. So the comprehensive plan itself would be informed by all these various inputs. principles of equity and justice to correct existing and historic neighborhood disparities and ensure equitable distribution of resources, climate and displacement risks facing our city really as a whole, but especially for the neighborhoods already bearing the burdens of climate change, community input to give every neighborhood the opportunity to lift up, preserve, and enhance what communities love about their neighborhoods, and prioritize their vision for change, all while meeting these citywide goals. So measurable targets for the jobs, resiliency infrastructure, open space, transportation, arts and culture, public health, all the good stuff that we need to fit in our neighborhoods in order to support thriving communities over the next 10 years. A robust physical needs assessment would inform those citywide goals, examining really for the first time ever all of the city's existing infrastructure and repair needs and the urgency of those repair needs across our neighborhoods, identifying serious disparities and identifying the infrastructure that needs those repairs most urgently so that we can avoid a crisis. And then last but not least, neighborhood needs. What are the budget needs of our communities as they stand right now, regardless of whether or not we expect those neighborhoods to grow or change, so we can prioritize those first and foremost in the city's budget and planning process. These are all standard and common features that comprehensive plans all around the world use to inform their process and that we've explicitly built into the legislation. So the framework streamlines and meaningfully connects the dozens of reports and plans and documents that are already required by the city charter, often without any opportunity for public input whatsoever, while strengthening and creating these new resources for communities to use as they proactively plan. So all the documents on the left exist already. Again, the city puts these together without opportunity for input and could together be conceived of as a comprehensive plan of some kind, but the charter fails to make clear whether or how they relate to one another. And on the right, you'll see the depiction of the news cycle, which would connect all these disjointed documents, processes, and reports required by the charter already to create one citywide strategic vision for the city. And this really starts with community boards' district need statements, which the charter will now make clear should directly inform the city's budget planning documents. The DNS would inform the production of this new conditions of the city report, which would feed into the citywide goals and plans, which would then inform the city's long-term plan and ultimately our budget documents. So each document will build on the last. And the charter will also require new milestones for public engagement before and after the production of each of these documents, which I'll walk you through later in the presentation. So the framework is designed to lay this solid foundation for good, proactive, community-based planning work to get done by setting clear timelines and milestones and well-defined roles for each of the stakeholders you see on the slide that could be built on and adapted over the course of many decades. So community boards and borough presidents would play an ongoing role in the 10-year planning cycle and would adopt recommended land use scenarios, which would then come to the council for review and adoption, just like 197A plans do now. These frameworks would essentially set the vision for what future land use applications would get measured against. The Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and its director already exists. This office currently goes by the name of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. The director and the mayoral office is responsible for putting together the Plan YC report every 4 years. And again, right now, the mayor has power to put whatever he or she or they wants into that plan. And does not provide any opportunity for public input. It doesn't come to the community boards for comment, the plan doesn't go through the borough presidents for review, and it doesn't require council adoption. So our proposal infuses new requirements for formal public review and council adoption into the city's existing planning framework to democratize that plan and the process through which it's put together. A new long-term planning steering committee and borough steering committees, I'll walk you through on the next slide, would subsume this existing steering committee that again already exists to help set the city's goals. And then finally, the CPC would play this ongoing role in their review and certification of ULURP applications, just as they do now, but they'd now be required to measure those applications against the long-term plan. So I want to spend a few minutes just saying a couple of words about this long-term planning steering committee. Again, this is a body that actually already exists. It advises on the city, the 1NYC or Plan YC reports. Aside from the Speaker of the Council and the Chair of the Environmental Protection Committee, the board is entirely composed of as many mayoral appointees as the mayor wants. So right now it has 39 members, 37 of which are appointed by the mayor. We are reimagining this body to be a more democratic, process with 4 mayoral appointees, 4 speaker appointees, and then 1 appointee from each borough president. It's envisioned as a technical body with requirements for appointees to represent groups and individuals who have been historically left out of development decisions. And they would really help the city's long-term citywide infrastructure targets, not just for housing, but schools, open space, resiliency infrastructure, sewer capacity, green infrastructure, public health, all of that stuff, all based on assessments of current conditions and community input. The steering committee would also be empowered to develop and adopt land use scenarios. There is a misconception, it's completely untrue, that this body or any body would be forced to choose between 3 scenarios produced by the city. So in the draft plan, the city would be producing three potential land use scenarios, which would really just be resources. And again, this is a standard feature and common practice in comprehensive planning. It would ensure that the city is doing some legwork that community boards usually need to pay consultants thousands and thousands of dollars for the technical expertise and existing conditions. Those land use scenarios would help New Yorkers envision different possibilities for the city, but the long-term planning steering committee, as well as community boards, borough presidents, and the council could all adopt land use frameworks of their own, either starting from scratch or making significant amendments to the scenarios produced by the city. But the steering committee's most important role will be the setting of critical infrastructure targets to address both our citywide and neighborhood-specific needs, rather than sitting that responsibility solely with the mayor as it is right now. So now I'll walk you through the process. Again, we've tasked the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability to be responsible for coordinating across city agencies to get this planning work done. The city's first task would be the production of this first of its kind conditions of the city report in coordination with communities and city agencies. So this report would take all the data that currently sits across dozens of reports and plans in the open data portal and put that into one easy to use place. It would revive the charter's requirement for the city to produce a zoning and planning report. So that's the only report that's ever required the city to regularly review the city's zoning code, identify challenges, and make recommendations to address unintended consequences that occurred when the rezoning decisions are compared with their intended policy goals. Bloomberg eliminated this requirement in 2012, and our proposal revives the standard best practice of just reviewing the city zoning code and making suggestions for updates. This conditions of the city report, sorry, I'm still on number 1. I'll move on soon, but just so you know where I'm at. The conditions of the city report would also include new analyses, including that physical needs assessment to assess the state of our current infrastructure for the first time in a comprehensive fashion, in addition to 2 new indices that Seattle uses to measure access to opportunity and displacement risk. The city would then work in partnership with communities and key stakeholders to determine the city's long-term needs for jobs, open space, schools, and other critical infrastructure. These would be measurable targets. And then through a robust public engagement process, New Yorkers would help decide where and how the city would distribute that critical infrastructure in their neighborhoods over the next 10 years. Community boards and borough presidents would then be empowered to adopt preferred land use scenarios for each of their relevant community districts. Again, it is completely untrue that community boards would be forced to choose between those 3 options produced by the city as resources in the draft plan. Those could really die with the draft report and never be revived again. Community boards and borough presidents and the council would have the power and the flexibility to develop those land use scenarios from scratch, only drawing from the city's options if the community saw fit. And in those scenarios, the community board would also be empowered to recommend adjustments to its infrastructure targets to advocate for more open space, school seats, or green infrastructure where you saw fit. Your recommendations would then get sent to the council, which would ultimately be responsible for reconciling recommendations from various stakeholders and adopting a final preferred land use map for inclusion in the final long-term plan. Community boards would still participate in the ULERT process as they do now, but with these new resources to inform their decision-making, you would have a plan to look at and measure applications against. The claim that this proposal eliminates member deference, I've seen that thrown around. It's completely incorrect. Applications would still go through the ULERP process, and the city council would be empowered to review those applications just as they do now. Member deference is not written into law anywhere. It is just the council's common practice. It cannot be eliminated via legislation because it is not currently written into law. And given this proposal does not change anything about the ULURP process, the council would remain empowered to treat individual ULURP applications as they saw fit. So this really does not change that. It just provides this proactive plan that we can all use to inform our decisions, which again would be adopted by the council. That's the body that would ultimately adopt and make that final decision. The production of the plan would take place over the course of 4 years, from the appointment of the steering committee to the adoption of the final long-term plan. The graphic on the left outlines the points at which the bill requires public meetings, adoption of formal recommendations, and council adoption. We essentially required some form of public engagement before and after the production of each formal document in the process, from the conditions of the city report to the final long-term plan. And again, many of these documents already exist in some form, and they're produced without notice to communities and without opportunity to inform their content. These are intended, though, to be viewed as really baseline minimum requirements for participation required by law. They will provide important milestones for the purpose of public transparency, so that we know when is what is happening when, essentially. But they really are designed to give the framework sufficient flexibility to grow and adapt that community planning process over time. This depicts the full 10-year process, including when each document will be produced and the update amendment process that would start halfway through the planning process. So after that first cycle, the cycle starts over again. Each plan would build on the next. And it really is just as much about the actual planning process as it is about the plan. This would create an ongoing proactive dialogue with city agencies about our infrastructure needs and our land use decisions in a way that we're just really not engaging in right now. Compliance with the long-term plan would be encouraged and considered, but not required. So all rezoning actions in furtherance of the plan or not would still remain subject to ULURP. Future ULURP applications would be required to include this statement of alignment, describing how the rezoning does or does not align with the long-term plan. Community boards would entirely retain their role in the ULURP process with new data and resources to inform their decisions. Aligned actions are in no way assured approval. That is a complete and total lie. Council members would still be able to reject the application or negotiate improvements prior to the approval, just as they do now. And the proposal in would no way eliminate environmental review, as I mentioned. So the bill simply requires the city to produce this GEIS, this generic environmental impact statement, along with the plan to measure the plan's cumulative impacts and make recommendations for infrastructure mitigations where necessary. So this is really to address the issue of segmentation. This is an issue that occurs when we do environmental review for individual projects. Often they fall just below the threshold that requires them to actually mitigate their impact, right? They've produced X number of school seats or Y number of housing units, and therefore they are found to not have a significant impact and therefore do not need to be mitigated. But 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 of those projects altogether would create a cumulative impact that needs to be addressed with infrastructure investments. And that's what a GEIS is really, really good at doing. It assesses cumulative impacts so that the city can understand and get out ahead of infrastructure challenges that are produced not just by projects that are triggered by environmental review, but as of right development. We are not engaging in any of that proactive planning work that actually takes into account the as of right development we're seeing on the ground and plans ahead for infrastructure to address increased population or other types of stress put on the environment by that development. The GEIS would also encourage the city to actually implement the citywide policies prioritized through this planning process by a broad set of stakeholders. A lot of citywide plans or policies actually require a GEIS to be produced. So by front loading this, we can encourage the city to actually implement the goals that we all set together and adopt by the council. The proposal will also make significant reforms to our long-term infrastructure planning to ensure we are spending our limited resources wisely. So unlike Plan YC or 19YC, the final long-term plan will be required to include detailed budget needs for meeting citywide and neighborhood-specific goals. So literal dollar amounts for what your district needs in order to address longstanding repair and infrastructure issues, as well as achieve your local goals. And so the 10-year capital strategy would really be reformed to reflect the full scope of our infrastructure repair needs. So the first half would be the full list of what we need to repair in order to bring everything up into a good state of repair. And then the second half would be a wish list of all the new infrastructure the city must build to achieve our citywide goals. Annual budget documents and the council's budget process would then prioritize those needs based on more robust assessments of our infrastructure. And these reforms are really long overdue and would create a significant amount of transparency that we need to hold our government accountable and just understand our needs and then address the most urgent infrastructure issues in our neighborhoods. So we think this process holds a lot of opportunity for the city as a whole and individual neighborhoods, laying the foundation for better planning work to get done by meaningfully connecting the city's budget, land use, and strategic planning processes, providing new resources, data, and analyses to support proactive community-based planning, identifying and prioritizing communities' urgent budget needs, regardless of whether or not neighborhoods will be rezoned, requiring the city to regularly review and recommend updates to the city's zoning policies in response to the successes, failures, and unintended consequences of the city's rezoning and development decisions, and then just forcing coordination across city agencies to better achieve our citywide and neighborhood goals. So that is my presentation. I will stop sharing now and I can pull up slides to answer questions, but just so I can see everyone on the screen, I will stop sharing for the moment.
All right, thank you. So I see we do have some hands up from some of our board members, no one yet from the public. So let's hear from Ed Hartzog, please.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you. That was that was an interesting presentation, and I do appreciate it. And I know how big it is, and that sort of shapes my comment. I don't have a question so much as I have just an observation. My stomach is churning. As someone with a graduate degree in public administration, this would be Mr. Waldo's dream in org theory. I think the timing of something like this in this day and age is misplaced. This type of long-term planning, I believe, just from this individual chair, is more for when we have a surplus and the time. I mean, a 10-year plan like this with a new city council being elected and it's going to be replaced in 2 years and overturned, and this isn't in the charter, and the money that I hear being thrown around, Frank, honestly, I believe it is more efficient. And I don't mean to backseat drive the priorities of the administration, but I do believe, in my opinion, that the public resources are more efficiently used to do exactly what it is we're supposed to do. Because what struck me most about this presentation is all of these things that we're redoing, and to use a phrase that's often thrown around, reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. That's what I got the feeling. Is I'm reshuffling the chairs on the. It's a great idea, but we already are required to do these things, and it's just we just don't have the time or the money. Is my opinion. It's just too much in terms of listening to community boards and having their input. We can do that now, and that's just my basic overall thing and opinion of it. And second of all, and I appreciate the time. Because I know at this community board that everybody's pushing for time, that for some reason on this community board, it's get it spit out as much as possible. But something of this magnitude, and at 7:10, my goodness. I mean, I hear that the pages on this are 800 pages deep, and you did it in half an hour. And this is not to be sarcastic, and this is not meant to be snarky, okay? This is, straight up, 30 minutes, my goodness, for us to digest. That's quite something. And I'll just leave it at that. It's just too much, and that's just an observation and a view. So I didn't have a question, but that's.
But Ed, can I ask a question here? Then back to you. I heard a couple things in there, so I want to figure out what the line through them is. I heard you think it's expensive. I'm just asking. It's not really. Yeah, cost, timing. I guess length of report. I guess just so I know, because I'm taking notes here too. What's the main concern here? Is it that it's the
money. It's the money, Keith.
Okay.
Honestly, it's and again, I don't know for sure what the number is. I can't read, the press. What's to be believed? I mean, you tell me here in the meeting, I believe what you tell me, but you would be okay with this if we in a couple of years, if we had the money to do it. Yeah, if we had the money to do it in 10 years, also, honestly, Keith, what really concerns me is, and is the priorities change. And the fact is that this is a 10-year kind of thing, and a lot happens in 10 years. It goes by quickly, I know. As I get older, I realize now what my dad said, it does go quicker as we get older, but it's still 10 years and it's a multiple of lifetimes sometimes. And
Okay, so we got money, cost and length of the 10-year plan. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
can I
I don't mean to be
spend-
all negative, but I mean, I like the idea, but anyway. I mean,
No,
I'm not trying to rain on the parade. I'm all for comprehensive, long-term thinking planning. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for that idea. I'm not against that idea and that objective. I want to make that clear.
I appreciate that. I'm going to respond to a couple of things just to clarify. So the city came to the hearing and said that it was going to cost $500 million to produce this plan. And there is absolutely nothing in this plan that will cost that amount of money. That cost estimate was not put together in good faith. We've been having a lot of conversations with planners and consultants that have done comprehensive plans for cities of a comparable size and contracted with the city of New York. We are doubling their estimates, and the number we're coming up with is about 42 million, including the GEIS, over the course of 10 years. So it would be about $3 to $4 million a year for the planning efforts and about $2 million to produce the GEIS. The city reached their cost estimate by taking the cost of the GEIS for Hudson Yards, which is the largest development project in our recent history. It added 18 million square feet of luxury retail and
Can I interrupt for a second and let my
No,
wife
Ed, just
development.
let Amy finish, and then you can ask a
Oh, no,
follow-up.
my wife is at the door.
Sure.
Can I just let
You
my
can
wife
go
in
get
real
your wife
quick?
at the door.
Yeah, go ahead.
I
Yeah,
might-
please
I
go
might
to the
keep-
next
I
person.
might keep talking. I don't
Yeah,
know.
go for it.
Okay, so it took the highest number that it could find in recent history for what was produced with a GEIS, which included an underground subway extension in a floodplain, and it doubled. It took that number and then they multiplied it by 59 for every community district, and then took that number again and multiplied it by 3. It was a complete and fundamental misunderstanding of our proposal, and it was really not in good faith. So we are working to estimate the cost of the proposal on our end. We always do in a fiscal impact statement along with the legislation. I will say that we made a concerted effort to reduce the frequency with which the city was producing a lot of these documents to make them more meaningful and to just reduce the busy work. Right now, we're producing these 10-year capital strategies once every 2 years, and it's very unclear why. They don't change very much from year to year. No meaningful planning work happens between those 2 years when they're put together. So we're reducing it from every 2 years and making them produce it once every 5 years. So we really did take an eye towards where we could reduce the burden here, where we're producing these reports for no reason, for nobody, for no purpose, right? And eliminated those requirements to actually streamline redundancies. So a lot of the work that we're doing, they're already doing across every single agency. Every agency has a planning division, DOT, HPD, DCP, SCA. They all have planning divisions of their own, and none of them are coordinating together. They're all excellent civil servants. They should all be working together in one agency or together on a project, and that's what this would do. So I really truly believe that we did our best to streamline costs while also creating new useful resources, so that we can better actually prioritize our spending on the things that matter most. Right now we're spending our capital infrastructure really in a vacuum. We do not have a good assessment of where we need to be spending money first to avoid crises, and that's what this would do.
Okay. I mean, just, it's ambitious. I'm just saying, as a student of bureaucracies and having been a member of a bureaucracy, and a long history of it, I know that as I talk with my wife who's in the private sector, and when we have these discussions and expending money, that public budgeting mantra of, if you don't spend every nickel and you're efficient in the public sector, they'll say, rightfully say, well, you can get by with less. And then, so there's this sort of warped thing. And so we're trying to build these agencies together. And as you said, they all have their own planning departments, rightfully so. And I don't want to sit here and reinvent the wheel with you here because we have a lot of hands up, but I just, I worry from what I know of life as every day as I get older on this planet, these are really intractable things. This is incredibly ambitious. I wish you Godspeed and good luck as you embark on the open ocean on something like this, because it is on the open seas out there. Anyway, I really don't have any more questions, but I'm just a little concerned of the size and the scope. I applaud the objective. I just, God bless it. Godspeed.
We're going to go to the
on the journey.
Thank you. Let's go to next hand up is Michelle Birnbaum.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. A couple of things. Firstly, I have a lot of reservations about this plan. Having sat through the hearing, having heard the head of the City Planning Commission, who I should note for people on the call who may not know this, they are vehemently in opposition to this plan. And the gentleman who presented to us in the past, Paul Graziano, he did present a point of view, but I just want to note that Annie, you're presenting a point of view tonight as well, and we welcome hearing everybody's point of view. I think we would have been, I have just a comment and then a point that I made last time. I think we all would have been better served if we were actually going through the bill. I'm never a believer in listening to the summation or evaluation of a bill because one person can evaluate it and interpret it one way and another person does it the other way. The pitfall is in the act, or the praise, whichever, is in the actual language of the bill, which I have in front of me, Intro 2186, and I urge everybody to read the actual bill. I had circulated it to the committee, so the board office has it, and I think it should be sent out. And if we have further discussion of this at other committee meetings, I would please suggest that we actually all go through the bill together so that we can see the wording, because clearly the wording doesn't necessarily support the commentary that we've heard.
Michelle, just give me, sorry, one, do you mind if I just, we'll go right back to you, but Ben Kalis is here. I just want to give him a chance to say a few words and then we'll pick up back with you after that. But I think
Sure.
his time may be later. So Councilman, if you want to go ahead.
Good, thank you. Russell, thank you for leading this important conversation. Thank you, the zoning committee. I got to catch a little bit of some of Ed's remarks, and I remember back in 2013 we were talking about the fact that planning in our city is fundamentally broken, and currently the only planning we do have is profit-driven planning. Often what I think are spot zoning, where a developer comes and tries to print money using the land use process. Community boards are forced into a situation where you have to vote yes or no at the end of a process with very little community input, and it's broken. Here in Community Board 8, when I got elected, we didn't have enough affordable housing, we didn't have enough school seats, we still don't have enough parks. The parks were literally falling into the river, like the infrastructure was crumbling. We didn't have enough transportation infrastructure. We didn't have any of it. This district we've had to establish that we didn't have enough school seats. We had to fight the mayor for 5 years to get universal pre-K. I had to write a new law to get SCA to admit that they owed us 850 school seats. And this committee's gotten presentations from the developers. I've had to track down and recruit in order to build 2 new schools in the district. And right now I'm fighting with the mayor because he doesn't want to give us 2 schools, even though I'm asking that, why, if we're entitled to 850 school seats, can we have 1,700 and integrate them 50-50? Give us the school seats we need in the neighborhood, and then we can integrate it. But he's against integration because he can be racist when it comes to our school system. And so we've had to do the work to get our own school seats. The HPD won't work with us to build affordable housing in the district. We've actually had to work with the government, with the state, to build 300 units of affordable housing on Roosevelt Island and preserve 600. We're now over the 1,000 mark, but most of it is because of work we had to go around this mayor, because he won't build affordable housing in this neighborhood. He won't give us mandatory inclusionary housing. We've had to put funding from my office through nonprofits to do planning, and CB8 is on record trying to do a rezoning for mandatory inclusionary housing to build affordable housing on the Upper East Side with, if you build below 210, go market, but above 210, you'd have to build affordable. This community board, I think, has passed 3 or 4 resolutions on it, and the City Planning Commission is ignoring us. They are refusing to do it. We've had multiple meetings with them, so they won't hit the affordable housing mandates. We literally had to form our own task force to take on homeless, the serious need for homeless services in this neighborhood. We've been able to open up supportive housing for homeless women. Again, no help from the administration. We were able to open up a new food pantry, no help from the administration. We did it privately, and we're now working to open up a safe haven in the neighborhood. Again, no help from the administration, the private sector, our office, we're working with folks, our coalition. And I gotta say, we didn't have a subway. Carol Maloney got that funded. We got it done after 100 years. The ferry, we had to fight for our 2 stops in the neighborhood, and we even lost one of our stops. When we go over a lot of the things you may be taking for granted that we won over the past 7 years, every single one of them was a battle. Every single one of them, all of you who've been on the board had to fight tooth and nail to get any and all of it. And so I put in the legislative service request to do this long-term planning. I think I beat the speaker on it, but I'm not going to argue with him. I was given an opportunity to sign on to it. And we need a plan so that you don't need to have Ben Kalos or Keith Powers or Dan Garodnick or Liz Kruger leading the way in your district, because most districts don't have that. And even our district, it is hard. It takes so much energy. I would just love to be in a position where we have a long-term plan and they actually say, you know what, you have to give this district 900 school seats so that we don't have to spend 5 years fighting for 900 school seats. I'd love for them to say you have to give us 1,000 units of affordable housing so we don't have to fight for it just to get to the place. And where we're not fighting for them to give us an affordable housing rezoning, but we can actually just start from there moving forward. Now, I've heard a lot of concerns about the legislation, and I am a sponsor. Sponsors have a lot of power when it comes to legislation. I want to get your feedback. I want to thank Elaine for having the text. Was it Elaine or Michelle who had the text? Michelle.
It was Michelle.
For having the text. I want to hear from you. Abby from my office is going to stick around to take notes. Abby's going to wave. Listen, you can amend this as long as it stays within the intent. So I'm looking for ways to fix it, to improve upon it, to make sure that we continue to give the community board a voice. Short of a charter amendment, which I support, I would give you a binding vote in the process. You know that because I testified about that in the charter. We're trying to do something that won't require a charter amendment. I'm open to a charter amendment in a different bill, but give us ways to make this better. And I will work with you to get it into the bill. If we cannot get this bill, if your suggestions and those of others in the community are not heard, I will take my name off the bill. If that's not enough, I will actually vote against the bill. But for now, let's actually try to see if we can get this done, because no one seems to want to do it. And if we get this done, there's a chance that the Upper East Side might actually get its fair share of school seats, affordable housing, services for homeless. And I forgot to mention parks. We've gotten $874 million in parks. That's insane. We did it with Congressmember Maloney. You shouldn't need a Congress member to form a task force just to get your parks to stop crumbling into the East River. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Abby will stick around, and also dealing with a lot of other personal stuff today. So just thank you. I'm just trying to keep fighting, keep doing the job. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I just want to say our condolences to you, and thank you very much for still making the time to be here tonight. So we're going to go back to Michelle, and I'm just going to briefly observe. I think Michelle's point is a very good one about the text. So we'll just put the link to the bill where folks can get the text, and I had sent it around previously. And I think, I would encourage folks, I think if there are questions about it or what does the bill really say, I think we have the capability during this meeting to talk about what's in the text. And I think Will actually could pull it up and put it up in front of us if we need to. But with that, go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you very much. And also, Ben, my very deepest sympathies to you. And I wish you and your family well at this time. Okay, so the text. Number one, nowhere in the text does it mention historic districts or landmarks. So there is no mention of that anywhere in the bill. And that's of particular interest to most community boards, and certainly at Community Board 8 Manhattan. Secondly, it talks about opportunity-rich areas. One of those areas, I'll just give you one example and why it's important to read the bill. You have areas in the city that are zoned for single-family housing. That could be identified by the city as a low population area, which would leave it ripe for city planning to come in and plan for increasing the population, meaning putting multifamily dwellings like 6-story apartment houses into an area like that. We heard testimony at the council. Those kinds of communities are not in favor of that kind of power to have that against them. And in fact, it could be done. Now, I'm going to just address, there's a lot of things like that. And if you go through the bill, you can see where the fallacies are. But on a broader question, I'm going to say what I said at our last meeting that was combined with housing. There is the city council, there are the local community boards, and there are also borough boards. They may not be called borough boards, but it's like a borough steering committee. And all of these entities have a say over what happens in each of our communities. Now, when these entities, and they may be acting on very goodwill, come to a community and ask what that community would like to see, that community is going to come up with what they would like to see for their community. So if they come to Community Board 8 Manhattan, we will tell them we want parks, we want affordable housing, we want this and that. If they go to another community board, that community board will tell them everything they want to see. However, they're trying to do overall city planning. Now, if each community board is going to be given due consideration and really have input, each community board is only talking about the planning for that community. They are not taking into consideration all of the other communities. By that very nature, the city government, the mayor, the city council, the borough steering committees, they have to bypass the individual community board because it is their job to mandate a plan, or at least suggest a plan that works for all community boards. Now, it may work for Community Board 2, in Community Board 2, Community Board 8 may be vehemently against for our community. Anyway, the point I'm making is it is very difficult and certainly not well outlined in this text to make a plan for the entire 5 boroughs and yet claim that an individual community board will have substantial input. Nowhere in this text do I see that that could possibly happen. The actual wording would have to be changed. Legislators would have to do that, but certainly the intent is not there. So this is of tremendous concern. And as this bill stands now, and I'll repeat that the City Planning Commission is vehemently against this for many reasons. Also, it is concerning that you're having, I think, 32 new council members coming in, new speaker, new mayor, new administration, new everything. This is quite a bundle to lay on the lap of people who may have absolutely no background with any of this, because they're all coming from different backgrounds and different areas of expertise, and we don't know how those lend themselves to this. So there's a lot more I can say, but suffice it to say, this bill yields, it's a big cautionary tale. I would be very careful, and I look forward to us actually going through the text, if not tonight, at some subsequent meeting, literally line by line. And so we could take Ben at his suggestion and maybe offer practical real, solutions. But it's of grave concern to me at the time. I couldn't support it now. Thank you very much.
So I think in terms of the text and how to use it, I don't think, I'm not sure that we are going to have time to go sort of line by line, but I think we certainly pull it up. And I think to the extent that there are differences or disagreements about what's actually in the bill, I do think it may be useful at some point in the course of the meeting to pull it up at times to just sort of clarify what it actually says. I think that would be a useful thing. I think in terms of just, I guess one sort of question that was in there is that, you know, are the land use scenarios, is it a one size fits all land use scenario for every community district, or is it each community district has something that's tailored to that community district? Annie, if you could kind of.
Sure. And actually, I'll just take a step back for a second to say that I agree that we definitely actually would love for the most specific and concrete recommendations around the actual text of the bill as you can provide. So thank you for bringing that up, Michelle. And I will just say that, you know, I'm not just presenting a perspective here tonight. I am presenting the legislative intent of the sponsor of the bill, who is the Speaker of the City Council. And so if there are areas where you believe that what I said does not match the bill text, that is something that we should address in the amendments, and is something that we commonly do in amendment processes. So I just want to underscore that commitment, that everything I shared here tonight is what we intend this proposal to achieve. If there are areas where we can make that more clear in legalese, and I'm sure there are, this is a very long bill, we are more than willing to have those conversations, and that's actually the most useful feedback we can get. So thank you for bringing that up. The land use scenarios that the city actually produces would look different in every single district. It would be responsive to the public engagement process. It would include sort of like a high level bubble map, essentially, of different types of land uses, not specific zoning, right? So we would not be getting down to R6A versus R6B, but we would be looking at our priorities for relative height and density along mid blocks versus avenues, and different types of land use mixes, sort of like a bubble map, very similar to what you would see come out in a land use framework before rezoning is initiated by the city. Those would look different in every district. They would have to be responsive to the conditions on the ground. The city would draft these three potential scenarios that would be included in the draft long-term plan, but then community boards, borough presidents, and the council could just start from scratch. They could throw all of those in the garbage and start from scratch. And they could adopt scenarios of their own. And that's the intent of this proposal. So if there are areas where we could make that more clear in the legislation, I'm happy to take that back, and we can keep working on it.
Thanks. Before we go just to the next person who's going to be Sherry Weiner, I do want to say if folks are going to be pulling up the bill and looking at the text of it, I think some folks know this, maybe not everybody does, but the way that's laid out in the text basically changes, like additions are underlined, things in brackets or deletions. Stuff that's not underlined or bracketed is stuff that's already in the law. And so with that, let's go to Sherry Weiner.
Okay,
Thank
I know
you,
Councilmember Powers also had a time commitment, and so I don't know if he has to run.
I have to drop off in a minute. I'll have like 5 more minutes. So
Okay, sorry.
wait, and I'll just drop off. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I certainly, as a land use attorney myself, I certainly believe in comprehensive planning. In fact, I was quite appalled to when I realized that New York City didn't have that. Annie, I wanted to ask you 2 areas that you seem to give different information than what we were presented at our last meeting. One is on projects that are aligned with the plan. My understanding was that if they were aligned with the plan, the same way a right to build project doesn't have to go through approvals, that would happen too. If it was aligned with, the master plan, so to speak, they wouldn't have to go through that. And then I'm totally confused on this 3 scenario. We were given the impression that the community board would have to come up with a scenario. And the question I had asked at that point was, how the heck could us volunteers do that? Are we going to be giving the resources to come up with a realistic plan? And now it seemed what I thought I heard you say was that the city was going to come up with scenarios. So if you could address those 2 specific points. And again, the idea of comprehensive planning makes a lot of sense, and I can understand why our council members are supporting it. But of course, the devil is in the details, and I guess that's what we're honing down on. So thank you.
Absolutely. So with respect to the first question, every single project that triggers ULURP right now would still be required to go through the ULURP process. So that would remain completely unchanged. The only thing that would change is that those ULURP applications would be required to include this statement of alignment. And that would just describe how or whether the application aligns or conflicts with the long-term plan. So that would be included in the ULURP packet. It would be sent to community boards as all applications are now, and it would inform your decisions. It would also go to the borough president for review, and it would go to the council for review. The only thing that the bill as introduced changes is that it moves a subset of the projects that are actually aligned with the long-term plan to be a call-up option at the council. So this is something that's very common in our ULURP process. The council member would just have to call it up instead of it coming automatically for a vote. They would have to get 7 signatures from their colleagues in order to get that sent to the council, but that would still trigger the same sort of discretionary review process. Even if we wanted to not have things go through ULURP, we would not be able to do that via local law. That we are curtailed from doing that. It would need to go on the ballot. Everyone would need to vote from it. So this does not change the ULURP process in any way. It would require that statement of alignment. And then if it aligns, it would require council members to actually call it up for review as the bill is proposed now. With respect to your second question, so there are a few steps in this process. Would you mind allowing me to share my screen again? And I'll pull up one of my slides that helps outline this. Okay. Let me find the slide okay. So we have this district needs statement from community boards. That's going to inform the conditions of the city report. Then this preliminary citywide goals statement is where we're initially setting these big citywide goals for what we need for all of our infrastructure, for schools, jobs, open space, housing, different depth of affordability, supportive housing, etc. Then that would get, after a round of public review, that would get finalized. Then the city would produce this draft long-term plan. And that's where you first see these 3 potential land use scenarios that the city is producing. And we required this for exactly the reason that you pointed out. We want to make sure that the city is actually doing some of the legwork and providing the technical assistance and expertise that they need to put into a plan like this in order to enable all New Yorkers, not just community boards, all New Yorkers to envision different scenarios and provide input and think about their priorities for their districts. So one, almost every comprehensive planning process in the country goes through this sort of different scenario planning, right? So one might prioritize job growth around a particular hub, or transit-oriented development, or resiliency and creating new open spaces on our coasts, whatever it is, right? These plans would reflect different priorities that would be pulled out through this public engagement process. And those would be resources for communities like yours, but all New Yorkers to use and to actually inform their decision-making. However, we did not want to lock community boards into choosing one of those 3 scenarios. Again, we don't know who the mayor is going to be. We don't know what those scenarios are going to look like. And you may not agree with any of them, right? So what this proposal does, we're envisioning it being in place for many, many decades to come. It gives you the flexibility to adopt one of those draft plans if you see fit, suggest significant amendments, tearing them all apart, right? So starting with a base scenario and then significant changes to it, that's what you could suggest. Or you could start completely from scratch and design a land use framework of your own based on the work and your assessments of the district over many years. So some districts have a 197A plan that they might want to dust off and completely start from scratch and just adopt that and send that to the council. So this framework is really designed to both provide a lot of the resources that folks need in order to just envision different land use scenarios, and allow you all the flexibility to be in the driver's seat and completely control that process.
Thanks. One of the things I just want to point out here, what I think would be helpful, and what I've heard from Annie and from the council members, is that they're eager to hear sort of specific feedback on particular issues. And so what I would say is, I think on issues like this, or on just all the various different questions that folks are raising, or issues that are coming up as we're discussing them and as we're hearing them, I think it would be useful to sort of think of these as sort of potential areas for suggestions. And so just to take the last item that Sherry raised about the resources that community boards have available, an example of something we could suggest is to say, look, we want to make sure we have the resources. And so if community boards are going to have the ability to do this, we would like you to add that into the bill, to add more resources for community boards to allow them to be able to, do this in an effective way. That's just an example of kind of a way to think about this as we're going through it. So Alita has her hand up.
Thanks, Russell. Okay, I have a whole bunch of questions. I don't understand how, and I know you've talked about it, but I'm really not clear how as of right fits into this. What gets adjusted for as of right? And which leads me to a question. The community board was very involved in testimony for both charter review commissions, and we asked for a comprehensive city plan, which my understanding was rejected by the mayor's appointees to that commission and also by Republicans. So what I'd like to know is why Rebney is in support of this particular plan, which I saw in an email complaining about all the YIMBYs on community boards and in local communities. So I'd like to know why they're applauding for this. I don't understand, again, the as of right. I don't understand why community boards are so excluded from this process. I'd like to see community boards much more involved. Instead of having community boards whose job month after month is to assess what things look like from the ground, this bill contemplates appointing people by an independent, not an independent, but a separate entity to sit at the table. And I don't understand why community boards are excluded from that. Also, ULURP is just simply way too late for community boards to have their first kind of bite at the apple of a particular project, particularly if it is getting some kind of easy pass through the city council. We're seeing that right now with the Blood Center and with Northwell. I'd also like to know how Northwell fits into this, because one of the objections to Northwell is that we think hospitals need to be downtown in other parts of Manhattan and in other boroughs where there is a real need, as we've seen through COVID. So what would this do for the Northwell proposal, for example? And I still don't understand the environmental fit language from the bill and why it's so different from what was expressed at the zoning housing meeting. And I guess I'm still just confused. And so maybe Michelle's suggestion about going through, not necessarily at this meeting, since it's already 7:45, but at other meetings to understand what's going on, because I know that bills have intent, and that requires going through the court system if there's a disagreement with how bills work. So all of the language, Annie, and please excuse me if I'm offensive in any way, that you express as the intent of the bill, if it's not actually in the bill, it gives a whole lot of leeway and unpredictable behavior for whether the bill applies or not. It sounds, there's an assumption, I don't remember who made the assumption, it sounds like that community boards and the city council are assumed to think the same way about how the city runs, and that may not be true. It feels like this is just much more top down. I'd also suggest that the appointments to city planning be reconsidered, because the city planning is an echo chamber and a rubber stamp in many instances for the mayor. So I just am very understanding, and I just do not understand how a lot of this works together. But what really concerns me is the lack of input of community boards who are diverse, who listen to the community, that's our job, and who would certainly, I think, have a lot more positive input into this process were we involved more significantly than simply as we are now or going through ULURP. So thank you. Thank you, Russell.
Yeah, all right. So ULURP is too late. I agree. And that's exactly what this proposal is trying to correct. So this proactive planning process would actually allow you and all of your colleagues to develop land use scenarios that actually reflect your vision for the neighborhood before ULURP is even considered. So that is the exact point of this proposal. That is the objective of comprehensive planning, is to start that proactive planning conversation earlier. With respect to Northwell, the proposal explicitly addresses this by requiring the city to actually look at every neighborhood and all of the infrastructure in those neighborhoods and address longstanding needs with respect to infrastructure and investments, and with respect to our land use decisions, so that we would be prioritizing building more healthcare infrastructure in the neighborhoods that desperately need it. As we've seen with COVID, a lot of the hardest hit neighborhoods are the neighborhoods where hospitals have closed and they have been replaced by luxury development. And that is a result of our land use decisions. We were not thinking proactively about the needs of our communities, and it literally has resulted in deaths And that is what this is trying to achieve. This is what comprehensive planning is able to do in other cities, is to look proactively at our neighborhoods. Where is there not enough healthcare infrastructure? Where is it all concentrated? And how can we have a more equitable approach to that? This does not upend as of right development. However, what it does is prioritizes longstanding issues with our zoning code that have been in our zoning code, stuck in there since 1961. It's completely outdated, but in order to actually get something done, you need to nudge the city so dramatically in order to get them to initiate a rezoning that actually fulfills your vision. And under de Blasio, that really has not happened. Unless you're willing to go through an MIH rezoning, you're not getting rezoned at all. Those longstanding issues will still exist. So unless Bloomberg rezoned you, then you're out of luck, right? Unless you're willing to go through a major upzoning, which is probably not appropriate for most areas in the city. So what this does is actually create a proactive conversation to change the zoning in our neighborhoods where there are issues and have been longstanding issues for decades and decades, and the city has just refused to do anything about it. And that's actually related to the reason why we included this requirement for this GEIS, which I know is creating a lot of confusion. I know it's really complicated, but I'm going to try to explain it again right now. So the GEIS is a generic environmental impact statement. It is required to be produced alongside this plan in the bill because it would help assess the cumulative impacts of development on our city to address the longstanding infrastructure needs that have been longstanding in our neighborhoods, right? That have continued to go unaddressed. But it will also advance the environmental review for citywide text amendments, right? So that we're actually moving forward proposals that we all support and come together and adopt through this planning process by front loading the environmental review and forcing the city to engage in that process proactively, right? Along with this plan, we're saying you need to look at the city's mechanical void issue, for example, right? So that's a great one. We've known about that issue. It was not yet addressed. We could put that in this comprehensive plan and get the GEIS to actually assess its impacts, and that would move it along through the city's process faster. However, each individual project would still be required to produce supplemental environmental review, and that's exactly what the bill says. What those supplement, you can look at the seeker technical manual to get a better sense of what that looks like, but it would basically have to, anything that's not in the GEIS, which would be a lot, right? Because that's assessing the broad cumulative impacts of the plan as a whole. It's not looking at individual sites. It's not looking at, you know, the specific proposal at hand with respect to shadows or construction impacts or sewer infrastructure. It is just looking at the broad impacts of the plan. So that would lay some baseline, but each individual project would still be required to produce supplemental review on the specific impacts of that project. What the GEIS would do is actually help address the infrastructure needs that are produced by as-of-right development. As-of-right development does not produce any environmental review whatsoever. We are not assessing the infrastructure needs that are produced by that development at all. The city is not proactively looking at that. GEISs get that done. They proactively assess our infrastructure needs based on the construction that's already happening right now, not even looking towards future development. What is already outstanding in our neighborhood? Where do we need those school seats that Ben fought for, et cetera? So that's what this would do, but each individual project would still be required to produce environmental review statements.
But if it's an, I'm sorry. If
That's
it's
okay.
If it's an as-of-right building, then how does it mesh with the GEIS? Because they could still put it up, and I guess that's what I don't understand.
So it would not forestall that as-of-right development. What it would do is ensure that the city is taking that development into account when it's counting school seats that we need. So that's where we're falling short a lot of the time, right? Environmental review is only triggered for individual projects. It sets very narrow-minded thresholds. And if the project doesn't go above that threshold, it doesn't need to do anything. It doesn't need to ever mitigate any of the impacts. It's done, right? That it's done its due diligence, but it could be right next to a building that's built 5 years later that puts it over that threshold, and the city still does nothing to build the school seats, right? And so what this does for as-of-right and regular development, it looks at what it'll look at building permits, it'll look at construction activity, it'll look at the school seats that are already in place, and it'll assess what do we need to build in general overall over the next 10 years in order to address our current and future infrastructure needs. That's the idea behind a GEIS. And again, other cities produce these. Seattle produces a GEIS along with their comprehensive plan. They are very broad, which means that individual projects would still need to do all that nitty-gritty analysis. shadows and all of that stuff that we all care about to make sure that that specific project is going to look the way it needs to for that neighborhood. That would not change. It would just assess broad impacts and get the city to proactively invest in neighborhoods infrastructure where they identify issues that have occurred, and perhaps a lack of infrastructure in other neighborhoods where they would be more suited for healthcare facilities, et cetera. And then REBNY does not support this proposal. I don't know where you read that, but if you go into the testimony in Legislature, in that same link, they submitted testimony that was pretty much scathingly opposed. So I don't know who's telling you that REBNY is supportive, but they are not. And finally, I agree that the CPC needs to be reformed. A lot of that work needs to be done by a charter referendum. Honestly, we are curtailed from changing the fundamental structure of the CPC, separating the chair from the commissioner of the Department of City Planning, rebalancing appointment structures. All of that would require a charter referendum. I think that answered all of your questions.
I do, and I thank you, but this is, as Michelle and I think everyone's pointed out, it's very dense and there's a lot of information to comprehend. I just don't see how there is ample time to really understand, particularly because you and Paul from the Housing and Zoning Committee are so far apart, and I understand that he has an interpretation. It's just there's a lot. I'm not disagreeing with anyone. There's just a lot of material, but I would really like to see an emphasis not so much on top down, because we've seen what mayors have done to the city. You've talked about all the various rezonings that this mayor has done that a lot of communities have opposed. So we need to see more, and I really feel, I don't think I'm alone in this, that it needs to come from community boards who are already here and have a lot of institutional memory and have been listening to and contemplating these issues for many, many years, and have a voice that should really be not just heard, but considered, and have a fair amount of input into this process. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank you. I do appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing more feedback and working with you. I just want to say that, I can't speak to Paul's presentation or his intentions, but I am here to hear your feedback and to incorporate that feedback to make this bill better and to address your longstanding needs. And I really want to make that clear. We are here because we want to hear your feedback and concrete suggestions for making this bill better, because you are the folks who work on this stuff every single day. So I just want to underscore our commitment to that, and what Councilmember Kalos and Councilmember Powers said is exactly right. We will continue to work with them to make this bill better.
Thanks. I just want to, before we go to the next question, with regard to, I guess, the concerns that have been raised about the scope of the proposal and that, we need time to process it. I think that's what everybody's saying. I mean, I want to be as clear as I can that I am not, we don't have to come out of this meeting with a decision on anything or any of that stuff. We can take the time that we think we need as a board to go through the text or to go through whatever to do it. I mean, I think everybody is sort of, what Annie and the council members have said is that there's essentially no rush. This isn't rushing through. And I mean, my view is that if board members want to take time to look at this because of the breadth and the complexity of it, I think that's perfectly fine. So I just hope that people don't have concerns in that regard. The other thing is, I think in terms of the, again, I think to the extent that there are sort of specific factual questions of like, does it say X or does it say Y? If folks are sort of have those in mind, if you could actually sort of specifically identify those, and I don't mean like broader kind of characterizations of it, but I think we are, if people want to, we could look at text of the bill tonight and, sort of knock some of those out if there's specific stuff where there's a question of like, well, does it say this or does it say that? Does it provide for, whatever the case may be? I mean, I think if people have particular questions of that nature, let's, get them out so we can actually look at them. Next is Lowell Barton.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to point out what this bill probably could use. City planning doesn't do it now. They do great work in doing studies on environment, shadow studies, I just recently read where a project in Brooklyn was stopped because of the shadow on a plant. But what's not looked at is people. With each one of these developments, a lot of workers come in there, and some don't go home. Some don't go home in one piece. And this is rampant throughout New York City. We lose hundreds of millions of dollars of contractors who don't pay taxes, use off the books workers. Construction is the #2 destination for human trafficking victims. Why? Because if they do get hurt on the job, they are told, do not report it that it was on his job, or your family will get hurt overseas. The construction industry now is being what was once a great place to work and get a skill set is now being replaced by bottom feeders that are not paying the workers, don't pay taxes, and they abuse the system. And I think that a study on who's going to develop these projects and who's going to work there and are they going to contribute to society, to our city economically, because, you know, if you have a well-paid workforce or a paid workforce, that worker spends his money locally, whether it be in the supermarket, buying new goods, getting better housing, going to doctors. I think a study on, along with the environment, on people and the effect of these projects have on workers is something that should be addressed. And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank you so much for that comment, because I do want to underscore that, you know, a good comprehensive plan is about like 5 to 10% zoning, and the rest of it is really programmatic. It's just as much about workers' rights, workers' development, economic development, workers' standards, arts and culture, and public health as it is zoning. And that's where we really try to force that coordination between these agencies and express both citywide and neighborhood priorities for job standards. What, you know, do we want to support prevailing wage jobs? Where do we want to be recruiting those workers from? Do we want to be training workers to better able place in those jobs so that we can be supporting our local economy more effectively? And that's exactly what comprehensive plans are really good at doing, is sort of bringing those conversations together. And I would certainly welcome your suggestions for strengthening that language in the bill.
All right, next, Elaine Walsh.
Good evening. I have a lot of questions. I was going to put the motion from the committee on the floor to reject your plan, which I would like to do, and then we react to it. So my motion is there. If I can have a second, I will then proceed. Anybody can do a second on putting the motion?
Yeah, I see some seconds. I see Rita. Looks like Peter.
Okay. I have reviewed this, and I'm going to be a little wordy, which I don't like to be. One, this is not a comprehensive plan. You have not included, and Annie, it's not you, it's your committee and everybody else who've done it. You've not put your infrastructure needs into the plan and what would happen. There's no mention of in the legislation about schools, sewers, roads, etc., transportation. So it's not a comprehensive plan. It is something that you put out there, and I wish our elected officials who have co-sponsored, Keith and Ben, would have talked to us about what we see in our community as a need. It was not there. But what
I'm so sorry. Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Or no, I'm sorry.
No. Let me finish.
I was just going to say that the legislation does include explicit references to schools, transportation, sewers.
It does not. I've read it.
It does.
It does. It says schools 6 times, and it says
it doesn't talk about how it relates to what is being put out as a planning scenario for each community. There are 2 things we're looking at. One is the report, which probably the 45 pages of the 54 are much more about ideology and setting a tone and then relating to what was done. Then you have the legislation, which is very unclear. It is extremely top down. There is a lack of community input. It talks about the mayor gets, in this new scenario of a committee, I can't even figure out what it is, strategic planning committee, that the mayor appoints the head. The mayor has 4 appointees on top of it. The city council president has 4, and each borough president has 1, which means each borough is equal when we're looking at this plan. There is no structure in there that talks about term limits for the committee. It talks about if somebody leaves the committee, but not how long they stay on. And it really talks about the process of scenarios being presented, and ultimately the OLTPS, if I'm correct on that, ultimately makes the decision for a community. So it denies us as a community really the opportunity to speak to what our needs are. We are fully aware in our community what our needs are. And ironically, and I will question the report, that our community that is quote unquote perceived as wealthy, we do not have the power. We do not have the services that are inferred in that report. We can try all we want. We don't get the zoning we need. We've questioned the fact that we've lost affordable housing, and that the legislature and developers move our affordable housing that should be here to other boroughs because it's less expensive. I could go on listing what we've not had as a community and want. I do not see this legislation that has been put forward really by a lame duck administration that would impact us and also impacts the city charter. We asked for a lot of things in the city charter about land use, and we didn't get it. But now it seems that this new approach might reach it. And I'm sorry, this is not, if you want to go back to the drawing board and start this anew and work with the community, but the fact that the community boards will have no input based on the scenario that's represented in your legislation, why would we support this? And I would hope our electeds on the city council and then all the others reread it and realize that grassroots involvement is missing. And this is not comprehensive planning. It's not even strategic planning, because I haven't seen what the opportunities are, what the threats are, what the challenges are. Nothing is there. And so I'm disappointed with this and would like you to go back, reread, and come back to us with input from the community as far as what our city needs. I'm not going through every piece of the legislation. I've read it. And I am very concerned about what would be turned over and limit community involvement. Thank you.
Can I have an opportunity to respond just to a couple of things?
Yeah, you can respond to all of it.
Okay, so there were just a couple of things I want to correct about what you just shared. So the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability would not be the final say. The council would ultimately be the adopting body. There is a very, very narrow circumstance in which OLTPS would choose so that we're not holding up this planning process, and that's if the council fails to act. This is a very common fail-safe in the city charter. A similar thing applies to our budget. The council never fails to adopt the budget. We always act, and I feel very, very strongly that the same case will be here. But if you want us to remove that fail-safe, that could be an opportunity for amendment. So I would suggest that you write that to us, or we take that feedback back and work with it. I would also say that it is absolutely false that community boards will not have an opportunity to weigh in on this process. We have built in many opportunities, including the opportunity for you all to actually adopt land use scenarios of your very own that reflect your needs and give you an opportunity to make amendments to the neighborhood targets that are provided, so that you could actually directly provide input on exactly how many school seats and what transportation infrastructure you need. This actually creates that opportunity for you for the very first time. And so I would just really encourage you, to engage in this with this proposal in good faith. I think I've made very clear that we are willing to work with you on improving it and strengthening the bill text. It does mention schools, it does mention transportation, it even mentions brownfields and sewer infrastructure. If you would like for that language to be emphasized more, we would be glad to take that feedback. The reason it doesn't include a SWOT analysis with respect to our report is because this is not the comprehensive plan itself. This is the proposal for the comprehensive plan. This would simply initiate that process. So we are not saying that the report we put out is the comprehensive plan, right? We are rooting it in our priorities of increasing equity, sustainability, resilience, access to affordable housing, so that exactly what you described could be better achieved. Setting those district targets for deeply affordable housing in your neighborhood so that you're not pushed out and so that units aren't lost to other outer borough neighborhoods. That's exactly what this planning opportunity provides. And that's why this has been led by the Thriving Communities Coalition, which is organized by the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development and includes all sorts of grassroots groups all across the city, representing a diversity of participants, as well as groups like Riders Alliance and Appleseed, who both are working on transportation and school infrastructure respectively. They've been working on this proposal for years, and they are our closest partner in this work to strengthen it, and we will continue to work with them and with you to make this proposal as good as it can be. So when you say to throw it in the garbage, I think you all are free to give that suggestion, but it would be much more productive for you to give concrete suggestions for us to work with.
Okay. Before we move on, Will, can you just pull up the text of the bill, please?
You can see it?
Yeah. Okay. Can you zoom in a little bit on the second page, the one on the right?
Sure.
Okay, so the highlighted section, this is part of the description of what the long-term plan is supposed to include. And I will just read it. It has to include quantitative community district level targets for housing, jobs, including associated needed commercial, retail, and industrial space, open space, resiliency infrastructure, city facilities, school seats, public transportation, public utilities, and other infrastructure corresponding to each such district that the Director of the Office of Long-Term Planning finds appropriate to include. The next section, section 4, talks about the inclusion of 3 potential land use scenarios for accommodating the community district level targets established by Clause 3, each of which shall include all applicable proposed future land uses, including but not limited to residential, commercial, industrial institutions, open space, transportation, and utilities, with indications for relative height and density. And then, it goes on from there, but I think that's sort of the relevant part. And if we could just scroll down further to page 6, subsection 5. This is in the section that's talking about the adoption of what the community district level plans are supposed to be. It says no later than 150 days after the submission of the draft comprehensive long-term plan, the long-term planning steering committee, applicable borough presidents, and applicable community boards shall each submit to the speaker of the city council a recommended preferred land use scenario for each applicable community district, and may adopt suggested amendments to the corresponding community district level targets. The next section says, I'll skip the parts about the dates. The council shall, after a hearing on the draft comprehensive long-term plan, adopt a single resolution establishing one preferred land use scenario for each community district. And the rest of it talks about what happens if the council fails to do that. That says that the council picks a land use scenario. So I just wanted to go through some of what's in the bill now that some of the specific concerns about what's in it or what's not, and hopefully clear up that a little bit as a factual matter. So with that, let's go to Peter Patch.
Peter, you have to unmute.
I was going to say, I spent 3 or 4 or 5 decades working in the private sector with planning. And frankly, it's a complex issue. It's a process. You can't guarantee outcomes. I mean, my one response is, to the extent that this makes good things possible, which I suspect it does, it doesn't guarantee any good things. My question would be both one for you and then one for us as a community board. For you is, what is the process and the time frame within which the council is looking to either adopt or not adopt this proposal?
So we have no timeline in place right now for a vote. Like I said, I am scheduled out through June to do presentations like these and to continue to get feedback from not just community boards, but all sorts of stakeholder groups. And so we do not have a timeline for passage. The speaker did make clear when we introduced it that it is his intention to pass it before the end of the year, but we do not have a timeline at this time. And I will, like I said, we're not going to pass it before I continue to, give all of these presentations. So at least for the next 2 to 3 months, I'll be continuing to collect feedback, and then we'll go from there. We really do need to engage in a legislative process that engages individual council members as well as all of the stakeholders that we've discussed this with to date, and reviewing all of the testimony, which, was hours and hours long. And so we're continuing to go through that process.
Thank you. I'm going to defer to people who understand the arena of, in this context, the arena of zoning and land use processes better than I do. But I would like, in some fashion, and I'm not sure what the right fashion is, whether it's one of our existing committees like zoning, whether it's an ad hoc process or what have you, to probably spend at least something like 3 sessions looking through, say, first the bill itself and exactly what that does and doesn't imply. Look through what I consider. I mean, my longest suit is sort of marketing and strategy, and I understand marketing and strategy. Part of what you want to do, and you do effectively, is identify both the values and the aspirations that are incorporated into this process. But at the same time, I recognize whatever good it can do, it also, depending on who's in charge and who's influencing it, can lead to negative outcomes. So I would either want to sort of table it, or defer trying to take a definitive answer until we could actually properly understand it in more detail than one 30-minute presentation, which was very well done, but I think very high level relative to the way this thing will actually function and operate. Enough said.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Next, Valerie Mason.
Hi, everyone. I have a couple of questions. I mean, I think, I just don't understand. I know I was at a town hall about 2 years ago, I think it was, where the council, where Corey Johnson alluded to this proposal being out there. I just think it's unfortunate that since the main purpose of community boards is land use, that we are getting this now. I know you say there's a timeline, and I appreciate the education, but you say there's no timeline, but Corey Johnson has come out and say, well, we're going to vote on it by the end of the term. So to me, that's a timeline. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, I find it interesting that the proposal, and I'll be quite honest with you, I haven't read it yet, so I will do that. Why does the speaker get 4 appointees to this committee? What gives him or her the right to do that?
We think it's a way to actually counterbalance the sort of mayoral control that is had over setting these city goals. So the speaker is the representative of the city council. Obviously, it would be a little unwieldy to have every single council member get an individual appointee. That would just be, I think, too many. I mean, this is a policy decision that we made. That would be a lot of members to deal with. And so the speaker is often looked to for this sort of appointing role. The speaker appoints, I don't know, dozens and dozens of roles in various city functions throughout, various advisory boards. So we use that to sort of balance the mayoral control over setting these citywide goals in addition to the borough president appointees.
So why wouldn't it be that the speaker proposes for nominees and that they're voted on by the council?
Sure, that would be requiring advice and consent. So that would be a great, I'm not sure if we can do that via legislation, but it's a very good idea.
And would that be for terms, or how long would those terms be for those people that are appointed?
Yeah, so we did not include term limits in this proposal, but that's another area where we would be open to specific feedback, as well as I wanted to point everyone's attention also to the borough steering committees. So this long-term planning steering committee is a somewhat limited group. It only contains 13 members that are appointed in this structure, which again, we will take your feedback on and take that back. But in addition, they would be responsible for convening these borough steering committees, which we are envisioning as a much more bigger group of demographically diverse individuals who represent the folks who live and work in the borough, that could help provide on the ground expertise and also inform the long-term planning steering committee's decisions. We got a little specific with what we would like to see with respect to diversity in that group, but we did not set the number of appointees or who would be appointing that body, or term limits. And so again, this is an area where we're ripe for your recommendations and would love to see what those look like. Other community boards have already suggested appointees from community boards or representation of community boards in some way. So that would definitely reflect.
So basically then the legislation doesn't address the composition or the terms of any of these people right now. It's just pretty much
the composition is the composition of the groups is very much outlined. It does not include term limits, so it's not that it doesn't include that requirement, it's that it doesn't set terms.
Okay. But also too, if I may, I mean, one of the knocks on the City Planning Commission right now is that there's not requirements of certain of the members to have certain expertise. And so I would think that something like this would require at least certain expertise of appointees.
Indeed, it does. It does explicitly include expertise requirements.
So let me ask you this then. So when you explain this to me, this sounds to me as if we're setting up a parallel universe to City Planning Commission and what they do. So what is the interaction then between these steering committees and then supposedly the existing structure of the City Planning Commission? Because right now, if you go through the Euler process, right, and you go through city planning, it comes back to the city council to vote on. You mentioned that there's just a deference to the city council member, and I want to get back to that in a second. But then whatever the vote of the council is, my understanding is that the CPC with the mayor can override that decision. So if you set up this parallel structure, what is the effect of that on that structure?
So the CPC would continue to play the role they currently play, which I think, as was envisioned in the 1936 charter revision, looking very long ago, this is outlined in the report, they were envisioned to have a broader mandate, which would not just look at individual ULURP and rezoning applications, but would consider a broader comprehensive plan inclusive of infrastructure investments. That was their mandate. Robert Moses really killed that idea. He said that the CPC should really just be tasked with individual review of ULURP applications, and truthfully, since the 1960s, that has been the case. They deal with individual applications as best as they can that move through the process. And this proposal continues that tradition in keeping them in that role. They, are tasked with individual review and certification of ULURP applications. They will be required to actually review this statement of alignment that applicants put together, and they will be required to actually explain themselves where they certify applications that are inconsistent with the plan. But they will not play a role in this broader planning conversation.
Okay,
this instead would be played by the long-term planning steering committee.
But what you're really saying is that your long-term planning commission, or whatever you want to call it, really doesn't have any power against the CPC. So they can
no, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, that's what you just said.
No, that's not what I said. I said that they would not play, the CPC would continue to play a role in the review and certification of individual ULURP applications, which has absolutely nothing to do with the long-term plan.
Well,
the long-term planning
stop you right there.
Wait, just no, hold on, Valerie, just let her finish and then go ahead.
Okay, but
the long-term planning steering committee would play this more technical expertise role in setting the city-wide goals for all of our infrastructure needs with respect to schools, transportation, open space. That would inform the long-term plan, which would ultimately come to the council for adoption. And then the CPC would review individual applications, but now comparing those individual applications to the long-term plan. So they would be required to say, does this application fulfill the vision that was, helped to be developed by this broader, diverse set of folks and actually adopted by the council? Does it or does it not fulfill that vision? They would certify the application and say, this is inconsistent with the plan, or this is consistent with the plan. They would be required to explain themselves where they're certifying an application that's inconsistent. Maybe it meets an emerging need, maybe conditions have changed, maybe there was another Sandy, whatever it is. They would explain themselves. And then that would still get sent to the council, which would ultimately be able to review and adopt the proposal or reject the proposal as it stands right now.
Yeah, but then it can go back to the CPC and the mayor and they can override.
Well, that's just a standard. That's just like how legislative bodies work in.
I know, but again, we're going to spend all this money. I'm not saying we're going to spend all this money for this.
I cannot think of an example where the CPC actually overturned the council's, decision on a ULURP application. So that happens very infrequently, but that's a traditional fail-safe.
I think it happened very recently when the mayor came out and said he didn't care what the council said and he was going to override the decision, and city planning did. I can't remember exactly the case, but I think that did happen.
I would love to know what that case was, but I have not.
I think it was a development project up in Harlem, actually, where it happened. But again,
we can't fundamentally change the powers of government through local law. That would require a referendum. So things like that, where the mayor has ultimate say over projects and whatnot, that we cannot change that via local law.
Let me ask you this: would you be in favor? And this has been, as you mentioned, deference to council members as part of this project. Would you be in favor? Or I'm wondering why. I mean, I understand what you're saying, that it's not codified. Why wouldn't you be in favor of codifying the fact that if the council person for the specific district voted for or against the project, that would be the prevailing vote? Why wouldn't that deference be written into the legislation?
You're saying that you would want that to be written into the legislation?
Well, so far, I don't see anything. You're saying that this overall plan, the City Planning Commission looks at it, they can explain themselves, but but what I hear you saying is, even if they disagree with the long-term plan, they have the ability to say, nice, but we're going to do whatever we want anyway. So I'm just trying to understand the whole point of this, because to my mind, if we're going to have a comprehensive plan, then that should be what sets the framework and the tone, and the City Planning Commission should not have the ability to override that, but have to be guided by it. And then there would have to be some overriding piece to do that. But what I don't understand is, in some of your slides there, you talk about the city, this amorphous city, making these decisions about, infrastructure, et cetera. And you mentioned that various agencies had duplicative pieces in terms of evaluating these plans. But I don't see, and maybe you can point me to the legislation where it says how these are going to have to be coordinated, because right now, this is the problem that the community board faces, that we make decisions about projects that we are in favor of or against or want to fine tune, but there's nobody to talk to. It's the amorphous city. And this is how we fail in having a strategic plan for our community, because there really is no coordinated person. I mean, city planning obviously doesn't listen to us, but I don't see where are we going to get the money to do. Is there a funding, like you talked about, like there's 3 scenarios that would be presented to us? Is that the point at which the community board gets funded to actually look at these scenarios and discern them? Where's that? Is that in the legislation?
So you want me to answer that question
Yeah.
first? Okay. So legislation it's not very good at explicitly listing dollar amounts for resources. So what this bill does instead is require the city to provide a lot of concrete resources that are listed in the legislation, including the draft, the potential land use scenarios, as well as the conditions of the city report. We are hearing a lot from community boards that, funding is a critical issue that needs to be looked at simultaneously with this. And so we're taking that feedback back. The bill itself can never say, and, community boards will get X dollars or any dollars. Actually, we are curtailed from doing that. But what we can do is actually set guardrails for those conversations to ensure that resources are provided through various agencies. And,
Yeah,
and to go back to
No, Valerie, let's just let Annie answer, and then after that, I think we're just going to go on to the next person, because a lot of other folks have questions also.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I want you to answer me, Annie, but you're not really answering me, because in a way you're giving me a right without a remedy.
She's just saying that, like, anytime you have funding for any given agency, any given year is going to be set in the budget for that year, right? The funding isn't going to be, the specific funding amount isn't going to be provided. I think that's what she's saying. But
I'm asking her to point me to in the legislation to where it says we have the right to ask for the money and that we will receive it, because how can we make an evaluation if the funding isn't there for us to do it? So we have a right without an ability to exercise it.
Got it.
Russell is correct that would all happen in the budget process and cannot be written into the legislation as it stands right now. But what we can provide is guardrails, again, actual concrete deliverables that would be provided to you. And we would take your feedback on that. With respect to your question on coordination, that's exactly what this proposal does. It forces agencies to coordinate with each other through this Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And that's actually one thing that Bloomberg actually did pretty well and sort of has declined since then. He used the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability as this coordinating hub, because right now, when you sit down with DCP and Parks, let's say, and even if DCP is really doing the best job they can and says, hey, Parks, where are you at with making that commitment or building that infrastructure? There is no reason that, Parks doesn't actually have to be responsive to DCP. They do not need to coordinate with each other because they have no authority over one another. And what a mayoral office can actually do is play that role, right? So they can say, you have to be responsive to each other's requests. You need to coordinate your efforts. Parks, you need to be responsive to the Department of City Planning when they have a request. And that's what this can really do very well.
Vanessa.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to chime in, not really with a question, but wanted to react to some of the other comments. I'm a little bit taken aback by how negative some of the comments have been, whereas I feel like so many of our prior meetings, we've talked about how much we wish our city could be more intentional. Should we be so lucky that our elected officials are proposing that they take the time to work together and think about our city and our goals for our city in a comprehensive manner. So I guess what I wanted to share is that from perhaps some people aren't as familiar with strategic planning processes in this such a large scale, this is something that I do professionally right now, is these longer term strategic plans. And this is exactly the way I would go about this type of a process. So I understand that there might be substantive issues with exactly how the steering committee is appointed, but I really want to urge people to think about the fact that this is putting a process in place to get our input, not just now for the long term, to have a vision for our city, but to continue bringing our input in. And in terms of the concerns about what the current state of the city is in financially after a pandemic, the housing crisis, environmental issues, etc., there is frankly no better time to do strategic planning than in these types of scenarios. You've probably seen it in your own life when things are a little bit rocky. That's when priorities sift to the surface pretty clearly. And so if we're able to put together a vision for our city for the long term, that is the North Star. That is, the compass that we can, or the North Star that we can use to guide ourselves throughout, as was brought up before, the fact that there will be turnover in the makeup of the city council over the next 10 years. That type of long-term planning is exactly what we need. And I also just want to sort of talk about the difference between strategy and tactic. A strategic plan, again, is something that is forward-looking, that is intentional, that is setting goals and targets, something that we can measure our progress up against. Whereas the tactics, and our presenter talked about this a lot, but maybe not in these exact terms, those are the things that can shift along the way, taking in the current context. So that's why she keeps saying that, like, there's still ULURP, there's still, just because these plans exist doesn't mean that they have to be, that there's no flexibility there. It's the process. She said it herself, it's not just that the plan at the end, it's the process. It's exercising that muscle as a city together to say, what are we trying to accomplish? What do we want our city to look like? What do we want our neighborhoods to look like? So I just wanted to chime in and say, for those who are a little bit skeptical of this, maybe you just don't have as much experience in this type of planning, but I think this is, at least an intent, exactly what we as a community board should be aiming for, a voice, a process, and a way to make sure our city is actually thought through in an intentional, comprehensive way, not reactive, but proactively.
Thank you.
Next is Rita Popper.
Penny, thank you. You really did a fabulous job. I used to work in an advertising agency, and I have done proposals for 15 Fortune 500 companies. One of the things that we learned, and I don't mean to denigrate this, but I'll use the aphorism, is that we always use KISS, K-I-S-S, keep it simple, stupid. And what it is that we're the shareholders here. That's the difference about private sector versus public sector. In the private sector, you have to answer to somebody, and you have to answer quickly. You don't get 5 years to answer if you say you're going to introduce this product and it's going to make your company billions of dollars, and you introduce a product and it dies. So I would like to see, I can't comment on point by point by point, but I think that it needs an outline that is consistent for every section, an outline that gives you the background, the mission, the objectives, the procedure, and what are the results? What do you want to do? You want to build a house, okay? How many families are going to live in the house? How many apartments are going to be in the house? Could you have built more? Should you have built less? Those are the things. I think that it just has to be simplified. It's almost getting paid by the word and by the pound. Less is more. And that's all I can contribute. I can help make it less. I can help make it more. Thank you for including us.
Thank you.
Next is Sharon Pope Marshall.
Hi, thank you, Annie, for that presentation. I have 3 questions. And my first question is, at the beginning of your presentation or near the beginning of your presentation, one of the benefits to the community boards or the community boards would be new resources, data, and analysis to proactively perform community-based planning. And I think that that was the first item on the list. One of the benefits of having institutional memory is I was thinking about the 197A plan that this board passed in 2006. Helene Simon and Judy Snyder were co-chairs. It was under, as a matter of fact, I went to get the booklet here, to get the plan here. And I was also thinking about the fact that I believe that there's less than 6 197A plans across the city, less than 6. One of the reasons is, one of the reasons why there are not more 197A plans is because community boards lack the new resources, the data, and the analysis to perform community-based planning. My first question, and I do have 3, my first question is, we have a format in place already with the 197A plans. And I'd like to know, particularly since some concern has been expressed that this feels like a top-down approach, I'm interested in knowing, why is it that the 197A plan itself was not, or the process was not elevated to allow community boards to write and complete 197A plans for their districts as a whole, using that format that we already have in place to give community boards the new resources, the data, and the analyses to perform community-based planning. Because with a 197A, a district-wide 197A, with the community district needs statement, both of those could enter the pipeline or be a part of the process that enables city officials to pull together a citywide strategy. So that's my first question, specifically with respect to the 197A plan.
Great, do you want, I'll answer that question first. So 197A plans, I think there are a couple of challenges with the way that they have played out. As you pointed out, not very many of them have been produced. It takes an enormous amount of technical expertise and resources to get them done, and DCP has done basically nothing to support their creation, and sometimes actively discourages their creation. Even where they are produced and you have a really great plan and it's adopted and it's put in place, the city, when making future rezoning proposals, advancing, neighborhood-wide rezonings, often ignores them. They will pay lip service to them and say that the goals and intent are fulfilled, but the actual zoning proposals that are laid on the ground are simply not responsive to what was in the plan or the infrastructure investments that were laid out alongside those plans. I believe what this will do is essentially force the city's hand to engage in the exact kind of proactive conversations that should be having through that 197A plan with every single community every 5 years. And the resources that will be provided to actually force the conversation to be had are a couple of aspects of the bill. I would say the first one is this conditions of the city report. That's your existing conditions report that you, again, would pay a consultant thousands and thousands of dollars to produce for your district. The city puts out piecemeal data across dozens of reports, et cetera, the open data portal that you could pull together, but usually you need a specialist to pull that into a map and really play with the data in a way that's meaningful. And that takes a lot of expertise. And this will require the city to actually produce that existing conditions report for communities with opportunity for public input before it's even produced. So really going out on the ground to see what's going on in the neighborhood. And we've gotten that's the one area where the bill is the most specific. We've really laid out all of the new analyses where the city is lacking them currently, especially with respect to physical infrastructure. And that's where you would get those, walk-arounds in your neighborhood to assess what city facilities are in need of repairs, down to the roads, down to the sinks in your schools. That's the kind of detail we need to be including in order to really make a plan for our neighborhoods that prioritizes the infrastructure we need to see. So that is where I would say, a lot of the data resources are coming from, in addition to these land use scenarios, which would be produced by the city. Again, those are just resources for you to pull from or be reflective on. Again, it is just a resource, but it does engage the city in a proactive conversation that really forces them to do some of the legwork to produce land use scenarios that are responsive to community input in a way that I think is going to be really useful. And the actual, adoption, the council adoption process that we've designed mirrors exactly the 197A process. It just, again, requires every single community to be provided those same resources to engage in these conversations, because right now it's a fight to get these things done and the city fights against their creation. So what we are envisioning this as is really a proactive process that can enable more of those plans to be produced. Where there's a 197A plan already in place, that could be codified in this plan. And that's true moving forward. Where 197A plans are produced by neighborhoods, regardless of where in this 10-year planning process, that could be the baseline for your next plan. That could be sent directly to the council and adopted by that council, and then the CPC would need to comment on every single ULURP application as to whether or not it fulfills that goal or if it conflicts with it. And that's something that's really missing from the 197A process right now, is implementation. There's nothing guaranteeing the implementation of that plan, even where it's put together.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll have to have some additional discussions about that, and perhaps the board should. We understand the 197A process intimately, and regrettably, we know that boards have not been either given those resources or were not in a position to raise those resources. And as a recommendation and as a suggestion, which is something that Russell had asked us to consider, and you as well, which is the idea that perhaps the 197A plan could receive some type of could be included somehow, because that is a way, and the format is already in place. That is a way for the community board as a whole to plan for our district. And a community board member did say earlier, and she was absolutely right, we're intimately familiar with the district and we do know what the district needs. My second question is, I'd like to know how the community board has passed a 210-foot height limit. And there are other community groups and organizations that also support a height limit. I would be interested in knowing how something like that, and more specifically, how a height limit, the 200-foot height limit would be processed through.
Aaron, can you, sorry, I was just going to say, can you also ask your third question? And that way Annie can just take the two together, and I'm just sort of sensitive to the time and everything. But why don't you just ask the third question now?
Yep, you got it. I'm also interested in knowing how the environmental impact statements will be treated within this process. Because what happens is that we get stopped with the environmental review process. So for example, there are two instances. For example, it does not include a racial impact within the environmental process itself. Or for example, our board is presented with projects that have a time span of decades, not just years, but 2 decades. It'll take 2 decades for a project to complete. And the environmental review process does not, there isn't a way to, after the first 15 years or after the first 20 years, to see whether or not what has happened is consistent with what was predicted in the environmental review process. So my question about that is, why not tackle the environmental review process overall? And you know, for example, we have questions about how shadows are measured. Why not tackle a revamping of the environmental review document, of the environmental review process? Why not do that, or incorporate a review of the environmental review process so that there is increased community input in how those parameters that so often allow projects to be built could be more narrow and give the community a chance to stop a project?
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. So on the first question regarding height limit, I think that's a really great question. And that is an example of a recommendation that could potentially result from this plan. So while this is really process reform, you know, so the process reform is unfortunate in that it cannot necessarily speak to specific outcomes, but the intention of this bill is very much to bring together the voices that are supportive of implementing a policy like that, not just in your neighborhood, but a neighborhood citywide, and actually prioritizing that in a citywide conversation about setting our goals so that that could potentially be included as a recommendation. And then that would be included in the plan, and it would be considered in future ULURP applications. And it could even be considered in this GEIS to actually keep that proposal moving, right? So that GEIS would assess the impacts of potentially, you know, imposing that height limit. And that would actually move, you know, the city along in the process of implementation and moving forward a potential text amendment that could get that done. So this is a vehicle to achieve those kinds of goals. With respect to environmental review, I agree there's a lot that needs to be done to the environmental review process. The one thing that this proposal does build in, which I think is really valuable, is this comparative review of rezoning proposals compared to their stated policy goals. So the city really does not do this with respect to environmental review or rezonings broadly. They've only done it really once in recent years. That was in Williamsburg, and they found that the rezoning that they did there in 2007 produced thousands more units than what they actually predicted would happen in both the EIS and the rezoning proposal. And that was the first time the city had really looked back to look at how their development decisions compared with what we were trying to achieve. The city does not regularly engage in that kind of process, and this would force the city to do that every 5 years, basically looking at a look back of all of our development decisions and comparing them to identify unintended consequences and actually mitigate those impacts and correct those mistakes from happening again, right? So we would correct our environmental review process. Environmental review, racial impact studies, obviously there's a bill that's, maybe this isn't obvious, but there is a bill that is in the council that had a hearing on that proposal specifically. I think now the amended version is actually attaching it to the ULURP process. There's a lot of legal and curtailment concerns around environmental review processes, and I'm not going to get into them because I'm not even a lawyer, but I do know that that is one limitation with respect to local law in terms of how we can actually amend the seeker technical manual and what goes into those assumptions. But it is perfectly appropriate for you to recommend that that kind of revamp be done alongside this comprehensive planning proposal. I think right now the mayor's office is engaged in a process where they're working with communities to actually update the seeker technical manual, I believe. And that is just at the beginning of the process. I am personally of the opinion that they should do that on a regular basis. And that could definitely be a part of what you recommend go alongside this proposal.
Okay, Elizabeth Rose.
Elizabeth, it's *6 to unmute.
Thank you. I have gotten the instructions of how to unmute. That's helpful. So I have a couple of comments and a question. I'd like to respond to some of the things that my fellow board members have raised. Valerie Mason, to your question of why not make member deference part of the legislation. I personally experienced, a situation at the Department of Education where we wanted to build a school in a neighborhood that was extraordinarily overcrowded and desperately needed more school seats. And a completely appropriate lot came on the market. And the Department of Education, through the School Construction Authority, proposed placing a school at that location. The local council member opposed it. And the local council member opposed it in large part because the students who, and this is now based on sort of all of the feedback that we saw to this proposal, there was a lot of pushback about the fact that there were a large influx of undocumented immigrants into the community, and the community did not want to accommodate new schools to serve a large influx of undocumented immigrants. And so that ended up being a case where member deference did not hold, and the school was approved. And as much as I hope member deference holds in other cases, there are times when it really could be problematic, and that it is not hard to imagine those cases. I also I appreciate many of the goals that are trying to be met. And so I want to ask the question about sort of one of the goals that I haven't heard. I've heard, Councilmember Kalo started this by saying we all hate the fact that we have to be reactive and that anybody can propose a rezoning. I haven't heard anything in this presentation this evening that suggests that will cease being the case in the future. What I hear is an effort to have comprehensive discussions about our aspirations and goals that may or may not result in specific changes to zoning. But I haven't heard, and once these aspirations and plans are adopted, that will prevent situations that we experience like Northwell or the Blood Center. It sounds like we're getting a aspirational but still very much top-down planning process, and I have a lot of empathy for the need for, we need 25,000 more housing units built annually for a decade as a citywide need. How are we going to comprehensively manage to incentivize or zone to enable that? When local communities are unlikely in many cases to step up and say, yes, we propose taking 15,000 of those units in our neighborhood by upzoning.
Yeah.
But I am not hearing the counterbalancing benefit of, and this process will put an end to these kinds of one-off proposals by organizations that the community then still has to react to in the same way we are doing today. And I'd like to know why not, I guess, is one question. And then my second question is, what city currently has the closest process to what is being proposed here? And what is the evidence of its success?
Sure. So I believe that what this proposal will do with respect to setting a proactive vision is give both developers and the city and just individual property owners, not necessarily big developers, but just people, humans on the planet that want to move through the rezoning process, something to look at and guide their decisions. So right now—
Don't they have that today? They have that today. It's called zoning.
But the zoning is what they're trying to change, right? So they're looking at the zoning and they're saying, we don't like that zoning. We want to do something different, right? And they have
so
no
what does this do to change that? They're still going to look at whatever the aspiration is and say, yeah, but I still want to do what I want to do.
Well, instead of having nothing to look at and just looking at their council member and trying to do some sort of political, calculation about what they think that council member will support versus not, and what the city will support versus not, they will have a literal map and a plan that not only identifies particular sites and areas as appropriate for different types of development of different density, but a list of the infrastructure investments that you all prioritized for what they would need to build out in order to accept that growth, if it is growth that's being proposed. So it would literally be—
So wait a minute, whoa, you just said something really big. So are you saying that it's the developers who will have to fund the infrastructure?
Developers often—
That's a state issue.
No, developers often do fund infrastructure in response to community needs, right? So, yeah. I mean, that is so, but in this case, they would have a literal plan to look at that has already been developed and adopted by the council, right? So they have an understanding that this is a shared vision. They know what the community board recommended. They know what the borough president recommended. They were participating in the process to the extent that they were a resident in the district, right? And they have a plan for the first time, which they don't currently have unless there's a 197A plan in place, that says this site is appropriate for this type of residential development. And we also need new open space infrastructure or more waterfront access, right? And that site is an appropriate place where they could be responsive to those needs. And that's true for both the city and developers. And that's something that's completely missing from our conversation right now. They have nothing proactive to look at. They are just taking shots in the dark about whether or not a council member will support or oppose something. And so this would give you all the opportunity to develop that proactive plan for them to be responsive to.
But why not just say nobody can build outside of as of right?
That would be a curtailment issue. There are cities in the globe that have that model, for example, London. And the as of right development does not exist. Every single proposal needs to go through basically a rezoning proposal. That I believe—
That's not what I suggested.
Okay.
Basically,
You're
so it sounds
right.
like
There is zoning. Why not simply say, absent a wide-scale local rezoning plan that has to affect at least a minimum of some multiple block area, there will be no as of right, there will be no outside of as of right development. Basically say, zoning is what the zoning is. And if you want to change the zoning, it has to affect a large area, which then requires the engagement of a large community process. But eliminate, one-off or very, single user, single site rezoning.
Got it. So you would only want large neighborhood scale rezonings to occur once the zoning is updated. Is that your goal? Because remember that this plan itself, so this plan itself, as we've designed it, is not imposing any zoning changes. I think it would be very few plans actually rezone every 10 years. It would probably be an irresponsible decision to require.
No, I'm not suggesting that
I'm just I'm just providing some context. And so it sets the vision for what rezoning proposals would be responsive to. I think what you're describing, we would be curtailed from doing, but again, I would be happy to look at this in greater detail. To be honest, it's getting a little late and I'm not 100% sure I understand your recommendation. So I want to understand it and I want to see if we can be responsive to it.
we have to move to the next.
So
we have to move to the. Sorry,
recommendation.
no, Elizabeth. We have to move to the next question. I'm sorry, but the question was about why not just eliminate all variances or special permits or only limit it to to as of right development except in sort of isolated circumstances was the question. But we let's just go to Craig.
Yeah.
Thanks, Russell, and thank you, Annie, for your presentation. First, I just want to second the views that Vanessa expressed earlier. As a planner myself, I very much appreciate the intent of this broad scale, the importance of comprehensive planning and strategic planning. I just want to make the point, can you hear me? I have an unstable
your
internet
video
connection,
is
so I don't
not
know if I
really
should
working, but we
shut
can
my
hear you.
camera.
We can hear you.
Okay, so I'll shut it so you could hopefully hear me better. So I just want to make a point that some of the concerns that have been raised, at least to me, seem as if they're to protect the status quo. I'm not sure that the status quo is going to really be what we're looking to do as a city if we want to position ourselves as a more equitable and fair city that where our needs are really met. I think personally, we should be thinking more universal in terms of addressing some of the systemic equity issues that transcend community districts and figuring out the best way to do so while maintaining an input and involvement. And I'm still trying to figure out whether this this planning together proposal really means in terms of that. But I'm glad we're having this discussion tonight and highlighting the importance of thinking strategically and the need to develop targets that we should be striving to achieve, and having these targets be performance measures we can measure ourselves against so we could assess in the future how to improve the process. So I have basically two questions. First, and I may have interpreted this incorrectly, but am I correct in that the current proposed approach would actually have this process occur essentially every 4 years once the first plan is formalized? And I ask that because I'm used to seeing comprehensive plans being on 10-year timeframes. So I'm wondering if I'm right, if this is a 4-year timeframe, if it's enough to actually see the vision be implemented and to have the data available to reassess things in such a short time frame. And then second, this is a comment and a question, I guess. In terms of equity, impacts, and displacement, was there any discussion regarding potential formalization of community boards working with neighboring districts to address development to be more inclusive, like such as when considering development needs near district borders where impacts would transcend community district lines. So I think one of the weaknesses of the city's planning practices is that it sort of promotes protectionist practices that have resulted in harsh transition zones between neighborhoods, both in terms of the built environment and the economic results. So I wonder if such a collaboration would further enhance the objectives of planning together and improve the chances of achieving outcomes that would benefit both our neighbors and the broader city community, in line with the intent of comprehensive planning and any targets that would be developed if this approach were signed into law. So I don't know if you can, and thank you for, again, for your presentation and your board members' questions.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. To answer your first question, it would be a 10-year cycle. The first plan in that 10-year cycle would take 4 years to produce. So that's where that 4-year period comes in. But it would be intended to cover a full 10-year period and even look, 10, 20, 30 years out beyond that, as Plan YC does now. There would be an opportunity for amending that plan about halfway through, which again is a standard common practice in comprehensive planning. So that initiation of that amendment process would actually start in year 7. And then there would be an adopted amended plan produced in year 9 of that 10-year cycle. And then year 10 would be like a rest year. And then in year 1, again, it would start all over again. So it is envisioned in that 10-year cycle. It's just that the plan itself takes 4 years to produce, which is about in line with what other cities, their timeline for putting these really broad, big plans together. With respect to working across neighboring districts, thank you for raising that question. I love that idea. It's actually why we designed in part, the community, the community board would be developing these land use scenarios, which would then get sent to the council, and why we think this works well for sort of helping to reconcile and bring folks together around exactly those conversations is because council member districts overlap differently from community boards. So, Councilmember Kalos would need to work together with Councilmember Powers, who would simultaneously be working with Councilmember Rivera on all of these land use scenarios that would need to work together. And so that sort of reconciliation process, as the bill is proposed right now, a lot of that would happen at the council. But I love the idea of sort of requiring or facilitating more coordination between community boards at an earlier stage in the process, because I agree that could be really productive.
Next is Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much for staying with us so long. With respect to the diversity of makeup of the borough steering committees, there's no specification as to the diversity of community district representation. So I would recommend it would include a member from each community district, if not from the community board itself, in addition to ensuring all of the other elements of diversity are met, because I do think those are obviously valuable as well. And I think adding on to what Craig was saying, that does help make sure, each community district's voice is heard, but also reinforces them working together. And so that is a very strong, as you said, there's no limit. So I think having at least one from each community district would be an important change.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Next is Anthony.
Hi, good evening. I have mostly comments, but I appreciate your efforts to reassure us. This proposal seems to me to be a change in process, or rather an additional layer of process. I have to admit, I've never been a process person. I believe in outcomes. I think this proposal is not radical enough by half. Is this a martini or a Molotov cocktail? This proposal codifies a plan that changes no process in a meaningful way. ULURP is unchanged. Market-based development is unchanged. As of right is unchanged. Without radical change, this effort is not worthwhile. Here's what we should be doing, I think, and maybe I'm the only one here who does. We should write that state of the city report, whether it takes 4 years or 5. And we should create a long-term vision for the city. And I'm glad you mentioned 30 years, because that's what we should be looking at. We should be looking at what will this place be like in 2050? And not so much what will it be like, but what do we want it to be like? Because any planning document is aspirational. What will we be like? What do we want to be like? What do we want our city to be like? And that'll change, but at least there's some sort of goal way out there that we can strive toward. Then throw out the zoning resolution. Start over. You're smiling. That means you think it's not a bad idea. Throw it out. Start over. Because until we do that, we will be hampered by all of the decisions made in absolute good faith 60 years ago. The planning process for the 1961 zoning began before 1950. So we're talking about a document that is in all of its generalities 70 years old. And I'm just going to bore everybody with some of my new favorite statistics. The 1916 zoning resolution was 14 pages long. 14. It had a bunch of maps. Okay. By 1961, when the zoning was rewritten, the 1961 zoning resolution was 270 pages long with 100 maps. 123 maps, I think. The zoning resolution today, the same document amended infinitely over time, goes to 2,700 pages. We now have 59 special districts. And we hope on the Upper East Side to have 2 more. And Community Board 8. And the aspirations reflected in those documents no longer hold. The city of 1916 imagined that by the year 2000, there would be 30 million New Yorkers. That was what would have happened if the 1916 zoning had filled up. By 1960, more realistically, the assumption was that New York in the year 2000 would have 16 million people. The fact of the matter is New York City's population has basically been flat since 1960, varying by less than 500,000 people over the course of the last 60 years. That's a really important thing to remember when we talk about planning and what we want our city to be like. In 1916, I think they imagined that we would be a city where everyone would live in skyscrapers, not just rich people, and that the city would grow and grow and grow. And fortunately, that didn't happen. But I think we have the opportunity to look now more appropriately at what the next 30 years are going to be like. And I am just afraid that what you are proposing is really a Band-Aid on a festering wound rather than a cure. And so I finally, though, have one question for you. You keep talking about the city. Aren't you the city?
No, I'm the city council. When I talk about the
So
city,
you're the city. No. Well, okay, then say the mayor. Blame the mayor.
That's a good note.
Say the mayor has too much power and that the mayor should have less power and the council should have more. And we might actually all jump up and down and wave our arms and agree with you.
Very good. No, that's a very good.
Probably would, in fact.
Yes, thank you for that.
Okay, I'm done.
Let's go to Billy.
Thanks. And Anthony, if you're offering a martini or Molotov cocktail, I'll take a martini, please. But that was great. And I really like everything you said, Anthony. And Andy, thank you so much for sticking with us. I thought your presentation was very, very impressive and clearly put a lot of hard work into it. I'll try to be brief given the hour. I just want to make sure I understood a couple things. We've talked about how this doesn't change zoning. You've heard from some folks here, a big concern of ours is affordable housing and how do we get it? Why not in this legislation or before we develop sort of comprehensive planning, why aren't we starting with, sort of to go to Anthony's point, revisiting the entire zoning resolution? Is the idea that you start with this comprehensive planning legislation and then you begin that process, and we have to trust in that process? And I guess kind of attached to that is, should we be skeptical as a neighborhood and trusting in that process when we've seen before, CPCs, mayors, even city councils that don't share our vision for the affordable housing we want? And very last on that, Annie, is our neighborhood's a bit unique, extremely dense. Some of our avenues zoned up to the maximum FAR. So we're not really going to have the option of, by the way, upzoning, which goes against the state limit. And if we want to downzone, which I think a lot of folks on the board want to do to get more affordable housing, we'll be told that's a taking. So I don't know if you can consolidate that together for an answer, but those are some of the things on my mind.
Yes, I'm sorry. What was the first part of your question was the affordable housing piece of this, right?
Yeah.
It's really, is this going to lay the groundwork? Yes, I think the answer to your question is yes. This planning process is, in my opinion, the best vehicle to initiate that complete rethinking and overhaul of our zoning code. Because to Anthony's point, right now, we've layered on so many special districts that people have really worked hard to get, right? Like people have worked hard on these special districts that are working well in one neighborhood. What we don't have is a vehicle to actually apply what's worked well in one neighborhood to other neighborhoods across the city. And that's created an immense amount of inequality. What is treated in one neighborhood as a preservation goal, other neighborhoods that look almost exactly the same are left with 1961 zoning code that allows for out of context development. What comprehensive planning does in other cities, and again, it is not common for comprehensive plannings to actually result in direct zoning changes, right? That usually goes through a separate process, but we can recommend the overhaul. We can recommend the application of those special zoning districts in other areas of the city that makes sense. And right now that proactive conversation isn't happening. Like we're all, advocating to DCP or to our council member or working in our own little worlds to try to get our goals achieved, but that whole citywide conversation needs to be initiated and taken seriously by the mayor in order to get that done. And I think you see that even among the housing groups that have been working for deeply affordable housing. The Right to a Roof Coalition, which is made up of Make the Road New York, ANHD, Community Service Society, like a lot of the housers, they all just came out with a plan in support of comprehensive planning because they believe it is the best vehicle to reach our affordable housing goals. And that's why ANHD has really been leading on this effort. So yes, I do believe that that is how we can achieve that overhaul. Otherwise, each mayor is just going to have their electoral agenda and they're going to engage in the rezonings that fulfill their promises, and they're going to leave everybody else alone to their own, world and not address their needs because that conversation isn't required of them.
Thank you. And then, sorry if I was interrupting you. I just want to make sure I got to my second question. I want to turn real brief to the infrastructure piece. It feels to me that it is easier. It's not easy to build housing in the city, but that it's easier to build housing in rezoned neighborhoods than it is to build more subway, which is one of the key infrastructure things we'll need. So you've talked about contemplating infrastructure in this plan, but how does this plan deal with the fact that as neighborhoods get more dense and you need more subway lines, it is almost impossible to build more subway? And this is a state plan and we need this is a city plan, we need the state to weigh in on infrastructure. Am I missing anything about how we close that gap and make sure we're getting the subway infrastructure we need?
Oh, I mean, that is a question that is a very good one. I would say that I am a personal opinion that, subway expansion at this point in our process in our city is so immensely expensive that achieving broad scale subway expansion with the dollars we have right now, especially in our fiscal crisis, is going to be a really hard goal to achieve. What comprehensive planning is really good at is enhancing all the other types of transportation infrastructure that can get people where they need to go for a lot cheaper and to connect people to the subways that will get them to where they need to be. So the best example of that is buses, right? We need to overhaul our bus routes. We need to make sure that we are increasing the number of buses that come to a certain area based on population increases, based on the types of riders that are using buses more frequently than the transportation that's already in place to get people to that last mile. And comprehensive planning is really good at sort of supporting the types of infrastructure that, first of all, the city can control, and uplifting the issues that need state coordination and really regional coordination to get done so that we can have conversations more productively and have a plan for them to be responsive to. I think right now there's just a lack of coordination for a lot of reasons, but having that plan, as Regional Plan Association has even done, you know, already, like in their plans, they are really moving the conversation forward on infrastructure, especially with transportation, in a way that's been really useful just by having that simple plan in place and forcing people to the table with a city sponsored mayoral, you know, whatever, a city document that they can be responsive to. I think that would be a lot more productive conversation to have.
Okay, thanks, Annie.
Thanks.
Next is Marco.
Thank you. Usually, I think that the best way to grow the city is where the railroad is running. And the only thing is you have to just change the zoning, increase the density, make bigger buildings, and put an infrastructure such as the sewer and the water lines, and it's done. So it's not nothing serious about that. It's very simple stuff. My point is, and that is my concern with this plan, I like that the idea of planning. I'm a planner, by the way. So I think in this case, I had to very concerned is what Elaine said is the community participation. I find very weak your proposal. I need to give more tools to the community so the community be active. Yes, I've been in so many community meetings. Many fellow community members always they go in the wrong direction sometimes, and sometimes they coming back because I don't know what is their goal. But the point is, that part I find so weak, and that is why they reject your plan. One. The second part is, when you plan, you can plan for 50, 60, 80 years, but you can never, ever reach that point. That is the experiences of planners. No, even you can reach 5 years, because let me put an example. We have two projects right now on the pipeline, two serious projects. The community are against those, the Blow Center and the Lenox Hill. Do you think the developer is gonna wait 4 years or 5 years to wait with your outcome of this evaluation or this planning? No, the developer is not gonna start wait. He's gonna build before they reach the cycle period. And when your proposals are coming, this will be too late. The image or the direction that the city going in the wrong direction that you are presenting. I think one of the weakest part, and this is a serious concept of planning, that you have to create something to control that doesn't happen, this development. One of the ideas that I have is moratorium for those projects that are running annular, because those develop, even as a regular development, because there are some lots ready to start growing high, very high. I calculate in one of the lots it will be between 700 to 1,000 feet tall. So the point is, if you want to come with after 4 years, it will be too late sometimes. The community already is going to start outcrying this kind of development. Why? Because obviously the poor quality, the poor vision of the past administration, not only the Blashes is one of the worst, but the others too. And I think your initiative is good, but the problem is I don't perceive how you're gonna be successful after 4 years, because you're gonna reach after 4 years with one conclusion, with one diagnosis. But the city, it was running in the other direction. So you are too late. And that is the problem of planning, regardless whatever you want to call. And that is my serious concern. And I don't see nothing in that direction. So these 2 points are fair that I'm raising, is not unfair. On the contrary, this is one of the serious, this discussion I has been myself as a planner for more than 30 years or 40 years. So you're proposing something new, which basically is a challenge, and I had to acknowledge that part. And I found that I hope that you will be successful, and that is my goal for the benefit of the city. But to plan for 50 years, 30 years, or 40 years, whatever years you want, is great in the brains of us. But in reality, the city doesn't move in that direction. The city always moves in the direction, regrettably, in the direction of money. So whatever they profit more, that's what they're running. The trending in our community is thinner and taller because they sell the view and make more money. That is the trend in our community. So that is my serious comment in your proposal. And I found it that I don't know how you're going to figure it out, but yes, I have some ideas how to stop that in that direction. And as a planner, I know very well this kind of stuff. And thank you so much and good luck.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So we have some hands up from folks who have already asked a question, but I want to go now. And I have two questions and then I have a couple of comments. So my first, here are the questions. So first, can you just explain a little bit more how community board district needs statement are going to impact the city budget under this proposal? And then my second question is, when statements of alignment are filed in connection with ULURP applications, do those statements of alignment include things like infrastructure, these various other categories of things on top of just sort of numerical population stuff? Is that included in the statement of alignment in terms of the statement of how this is supposed to align with what the community wants, or what's in the land use scenario for a district?
Yeah, thank you. Those are two really good questions. So district need statements right now, and I don't know if this has been your experience, but what I'm hearing all across the city is that, right now there's a lot of work to put them together. And for the most part, when you put together your budget requests, they largely go ignored. Requests are, either completely outright rejected or referred to a council member for funding, or, the funding was already there to begin with, and they're very proud to say that they have approved your request, but actually they were planning to fund it anyway. And so I think that there's a lot of frustration around these documents, that a lot of work goes into them and they are not taken seriously. So I think there's a couple of ways that we will be sort of strengthening their role. We would be essentially setting those at the front of this process, and they would still be produced on a regular basis. So it wouldn't reduce, we're basically saying that would be the first step in this process, that you would produce these documents. They would also be informed by these new robust analyses of infrastructure needs, which that data isn't currently available to you. So while you have all of your expertise and you gather community input on sort of what you want to prioritize, you're missing all of the sort of objective data that the city and these agencies could provide to actually give you assessments of what's in the most urgent need of repair, where things need to be expanded to address capacity issues, where there are serious resiliency issues going on in your infrastructure, what's actually the most vulnerable to sea level rise or saltwater infiltration or whatever it is, right? All of that information is missing. And so by providing you with all that information, you can produce a lot more, thorough and documents that can actually be directly filtered into the planning process. And the long-term plan itself would be required to be responsive to those needs. So this is another area where we would take your recommendations for sort of strengthening that piece of the legislation in particular. But our intention very much is to sort of root that as the sort of baseline information for what would end up in the long-term plan and then be prioritized in annual budget documents. And then with respect to the statements of alignment, we included in the legislation, essentially, the CPC would be required to go through the city's official rulemaking process for setting the rules for how they're going to actually determine alignment with the long-term plan. We can get more specific in this legislation with respect to how they should do that. But by actually imposing that sort of CAPA rulemaking process, we think we can infuse sort of another ongoing conversation with opportunities for public input to explicitly, shape exactly what they're going to need to look at to determine consistency in a way that I think will be really useful, as opposed to just sort of leaving that to their interpretation interpretation. Even the way we could sort of specify that in the law, I think we can get a little bit more specific. So if you have suggestions, like with respect to being reflective of the infrastructure needs, I think that's something we could certainly include. But the rulemaking process, I think, would really get down to the nitty-gritty, right? So they would be explicitly describing how they would treat individual applications with respect to the land use scenarios that are provided, the different types of land uses that are proposed, and how they're going to compare that to the application, in addition to the specific infrastructure investments that the developer is committing to and how that compares with what's in the plan. So that's where that would sort of get fleshed out and would have opportunity for community input in that process.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so then, just getting to some comments really for the board. I mean, one of the things seems to me that, and I guess this is a comment for you also, Annie, I mean, I would like to see that added. I think that's an area that, we could strengthen the bill if we make clear that we want to make sure that statements of alignment are including all the various aspects of the thing that are included in the, that are included in the land use scenarios. I just want to make a couple of observations here. I think in terms of, in our looking at this, I think it's just, it's important to just keep in mind the drawbacks of the current system. And I think some of the concerns in some cases are, concerns that are present in the current system, and maybe this proposal doesn't fix those. And if we want those to be fixed, I think those are suggestions that we could make, but I think they're not necessarily flaws in the current legislation in the sense that they're not problems that the proposal is introducing. There are problems with the existing circumstance. And so, for example, the ability of non as of right development to sort of ever take place is, an example of that. But just in general, I mean, I think under the current system, basically you have a city planning commission that's entirely controlled by the mayor. You really, our only input as a community board into zoning decisions is in the context of these ULURP applications. And aside from that, we really don't get to weigh in. And obviously, it's a lot of that stuff is out of our hands. I mean, we're not deciding that stuff. We're just, as was said, we're just being reactive. And what I think that this gives us an opportunity to do is it provides a system for the community board to provide input ahead of time to say, if something's going to be built in our district, and if somebody's looking to build something in our district, here's what we want. Here's where we want it, and here's what we want it to be accompanied by. And so to me, that's an improvement. And I also think taking, in terms of the CPC, the City Planning Commission, ordinarily this board is pretty critical of the City Planning Commission. I mean, to me, the fact that the City Planning Commission is against it is a feature, not a bug. And it's not surprising to me that they're opposed to it, because it takes a lot of power away from them. I mean, basically things that are nominally their responsibility in terms of long-term planning, even though they don't really do them, would now be under this different entity. And it would be an entity that, instead of being wholly controlled by the mayor, would work in consultation with this board that has membership appointed by different people. So to me, that's a kind of diffusion of authority that I think is positive. I think in terms of the member deference question, currently member deference is not part of the law. It's not in any city ordinance or anything like that. It's just it's a norm, it's a custom, right? And so the reason that it's there, or the reason that it happens, is because of reciprocity. I mean, council members basically defer to one another because they want other council members to defer to them. And the reason that it works is because ultimately, the city council, unless they're overruled in the ULURP process by the mayor, which is rare, but can happen, although obviously the city council can then overrule a veto. The city council has the ultimate authority as to whether an application is going to be approved or not. And so the other members defer to them. And I think that dynamic is still here, because you have the city council ultimately being the deciders who determine what the land use scenario in any given district is going to be. And so, assuming that members are going to still want the same reciprocity in that scenario that they want in other scenarios, then, it seems to me you've still got member deference. And certainly I don't think this bill does anything to undermine that. And I'll just observe also that, I mean, generally, elected officials are not in the habit of putting in legislation that's going to diminish their own power. So I just think, you know, the city council isn't going to be putting something in that sort of diminishes their own authority. I will say one of the things that I pointed out in my testimony was the Borough Steering Committee. It seems to me is just sort of duplicative and basically just worse than borough boards and community boards. So I mean, just a recommendation I would have would be to just take those out entirely. I don't think we need them. You know, these are all sort of substantive comments on the proposal. And I think just in general, what I think we should do tonight, I mean, I've heard a number of people say they want more time. Obviously, it's complicated. There's a lot of bill text to go through, and it sounds like some people haven't had a chance to do that fully. I think there's a wide array of you know, views on you know, on this, and I think, you know, there are different views on different aspects of it as to, you know, does it go far enough, does it go too far, things of that nature. I mean, I just think we need more discussion on it. I think fortunately we have the time to do it. So I mean, my suggestion would be, and I think basically every one of the thoughtful concerns that have been raised, I think can be implemented or incorporated into a suggestion on how to improve the bill. And I think what we're hearing pretty uniformly, particularly from, you know, including from, I should say, the council members, is that, you know, community input on this is going to be very welcome. So all that to say is, you know, I think that there is technically, there is currently, I shouldn't say technically, there is a resolution on the floor. And I don't think it makes sense for us to just say, no, toss this out entirely. What I think would be a lot more constructive would be for us to make suggestions as for what we would like to see improved in the bill. So I think we should either vote down the resolution or perhaps move to table it. And, you know, we can give this a little more thought, and we can hear some more at another meeting. I do want to, if folks have, why don't we, before going to any motions to that effect, I want to hear from the other folks who had their hands raised. So Barry, I'll go to you because you haven't spoken yet, but I'm going to want, if there are other substantive comments, then I'd like to hear those before we actually move to table it or vote on something.
Well, my motion was to table the motion, but I will defer to you, Russell.
Okay, thanks. So let's hear from Alita.
Thank you. I'd just like to go back. I'm sorry, I'm ringing and dinging. I just want to go back to what you had read earlier, Russell, which is the portion, and then I'd like to second any motion to table it. But in paragraph 4D, little 3I, it says that there'll be quantitative community district level targets, blah, 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 to the extent that the director of the Office of Long-Term Planning finds appropriate to include. So that means that the director at his or her whim or discretion, or however you want to phrase it, could completely eliminate any input from a community district. And that, I think, points to the lack of community involvement in this. Having said that, I know that I do believe that we need to hear from the other side, that the whole board needs to hear from the other side. And as you pointed out in your email, I think we should hear from George Janes before having any vote on this resolution at all, or any vote on this legislation at all. I'm sorry for the background noise too. I have a small apartment.
That's okay.
And it's busy.
I just want to clarify. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I
That's
clarify
okay.
one thing about the bill text?
Yeah, I'm gonna go to you just 1 second. So,
Okay.
so why don't we? That's okay. No. So Barry, let's say Barry has made his motion. Alita has seconded it. It's on the floor. It hasn't been called yet. So we're gonna hear from more folks. And yeah, go ahead, Annie, and just address that.
Yeah, so that clause, and again, we can make this more clear, but that just reflects which buckets of infrastructure will be included in the recommendations. So this law, as written, would require targets to be developed for each of these buckets: housing, jobs, including retail, industrial space, open space, resiliency infrastructure. And then what that clause does is say, if the director wants to add some buckets to this list, they can do so. That's all that clause says, and we can try to make that more clear.
Yeah, I think you should, because that's not how I read it at all.
I
And
know.
hopefully, yeah, that everyone would be in agreement with you. So, and I think that there are other provisions like it in this legislation, and that's another reason why it seems early to vote on anything, because it's a dense, very, very critical piece of legislation that just needs to be examined, to hear from you, to hear from the other side, before we, a major stakeholder in this and in the city and the community and our constituents, can actually vote on it. Thank you very much, Annie. I know you must be exhausted. Thank you for staying.
Thank you for being here and listening to me all night. I appreciate it.
Well, as I said, we're vested. Sorry,
Yeah,
Russell.
that's okay. Yeah, so just quick follow up on what Alita said. Can you just clarify a little bit and briefly on how the development of the targets works?
Yeah, so the long-term planning steering committee would really play the strongest role, and that would be this body that would be appointed by the speaker and the mayor and all of the borough presidents. They would look at objective data and assessments, and with resources, assess basically what the city's long-term targets should be in these areas. And if the director wanted to add some additional targets in that long-term plan, they could so do, but the actual targets that are listed here would be required to be included and would be set by the long-term planning steering committee, and that would be sort of a binding vote that would be included in the plan.
Okay, and what happens, I'm sorry for this, so what happens if the community board, let's say, doesn't like the targets or doesn't agree with the targets? What sort of recourse do they have, basically?
Yeah, so all of these targets would be described for the first time really in this, well, the citywide goal statement would produce the citywide level goals. So that would say like, okay, what does the whole city need? And that would come before the draft plan with respect to all of these buckets of infrastructure. They would also in that preliminary or in that citywide goal statement describe the methodology for how they're going to actually distribute that infrastructure or suggest distributing that infrastructure to districts across the city with an eye towards equity. So that would be with equitable equitable distribution of resources and prioritizing any projected growth in areas that are identified as having high access to opportunity, having a lot of infrastructure in place, having the capacity to actually build more development without putting pressure on the infrastructure, and with low risk for displacement. So that would be away from low-lying areas from vulnerable to sea level rise and displacement risks that are particularly vulnerable to speculation. And so they would set that methodology. This would be this technical body, and that would help set the actual district level goals that would appear in that draft plan. So this again would be the draft. It would include lots of different scenarios. It would include district level targets, but the community board would then adopt a land use scenario, which could explicitly amend those targets, right? So you would be sending a recommendation to the council that says, we don't agree with the targets that were set in this draft plan in these 3 areas or these 7 areas or these 17 areas, and you would be recommending amendments, describing your rationale. Maybe there's a particular population that needs to be served. Maybe they undercounted, whatever it is, healthcare facilities or healthcare beds, and you believe that it needs to be, better assessed. And that would all get sent to the council, and the council would be in the driver's seat for actually adopting the land use scenarios along with those amendments.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Kaz, go ahead.
Listening to all the comments tonight, how many community boards have you gone to so far, and how many more do you have to go? I assume you're going to go through this many, many times. And it sounds like we will still be recommending. The city council will still make the final decision. I mean, what we want in our area is going to be completely different to what Staten Island or the Bronx or Queens or other parts of Manhattan want. So we can recommend things that we wish, but ultimately they could be, denied. So we could end up with exactly where we are now.
I understand the concern. So to actually answer your question, I want to say, I mean, there are 59 community districts. I haven't been to anywhere near all of them. I am the only one giving these presentations, and there is only one of me. So we are doing this by request and engaging with folks as they see fit and with council members directly. I want to say
so maybe you should duplicate yourself.
Yeah, that would be helpful. But yeah, I think I've done probably 10 of these, and I've got probably, 10 of them more scheduled. Some community boards are asking me to come back more than once, but community boards are not the only folks that I'm meeting with. There are lots and lots of other stakeholders that are engaged in this conversation that represent all sorts of different interests and populations with respect to homelessness and waterfront needs and industrial retention and transportation, whatever. This is a comprehensive plan, so we were really doing our best to engage folks in all of these areas to get their input and their expertise to make this as strong as it can be, without locking it into such specificity that it's not a useful document for the folks that need to be interpreting this decades to come from now. And so I think ultimately I'm being responsive to all of the requests that come in and coming out to all sorts of different groups, and will continue to do so. But this is actually kind of somewhat rare for a legislative proposal. Generally speaking, we engage with the council members who represent their constituents, which we of course will do in addition to all of this proactive outreach. And so I just want to underscore that your council member will ultimately need to vote on this. And in your case, your council members are actually two sponsors of the bill. And so that is going to be, a big part of this conversation, and always is in legislation. We're just trying to go above and beyond, given the scope and the impact of what we're trying to achieve here, to engage folks where they're interested and really answer their questions and get feedback wherever we can.
So when would you be making the final decision of what goes in the bill and everything? Is there a time limit? Are you coming back to us, or this is it?
I will come back if you would like for me to. As I mentioned, the speaker made clear that it is his intention to pass this bill before the end of the year, but we do not have a timeline in place, and I am scheduled to do these presentations for the next 2 to 3 months at least. So what I would say is that it would be great to get concrete recommendations from you all within the next 3 months. And that would be super helpful to me, and it would mean that I would have time to process that alongside all of the other recommendations and make sure that I'm giving it due diligence and coming back to ask questions, et cetera. But that timeline is still very flexible. There's no passage date scheduled. We don't have a committee vote scheduled. We really still are at the beginning of the process and having these conversations.
Okay, so we've got 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, don't hold me to that with respect to if it goes longer than that, but it would be helpful to get your feedback within the next 2 to 3 months.
Well, that's okay. You're on tape giving us 3 months.
All right, let's go to the next. Michelle and Billy have their hands up. Both of them have already spoken. So just before I go to you guys, if you have, in particular, if you have questions for Annie, I want you to have the opportunity to ask those. But if you have comments, I would ask that you be very, very brief, as brief as possible, so we can get out of here. But with that, I will go to Michelle.
Thank you, Russell. What I was going to propose is a way for us to go forward. And I wonder if it would be a good idea to form a small committee to actually sit down with the bill and rewrite it in other words, address it line by line in a small committee. We have land use attorneys. We have others who are just interested, whatever, and they could submit their names to Russell, form a small committee, go through the bill line by line by line, and address it in terms of the comments we've heard from our members tonight, try to incorporate it or make changes as best we can, and then present that to zoning and then to land use and then to the board and to see, or to you first, Russell, and see how that plays out. Because it seems to me we each have suggestions how we would change, each of the sections, and rather than commit it to memory or have poor Annie remember it or have to listen to this whole meeting again just to recall it, maybe, as I say, we can address it in a small committee of maybe 6 or 7 people that could sit down, rewrite it as in our best interest. Let's put it that way.
I think
and
that's
then
a fine
see
idea.
where it goes.
Okay, that's a good idea. So I think we very well may do that. I think that's a good suggestion. All right, so with that, I would say I'm just going to call the question on Barry's motion. So is there a second to that? Did a leader raise her hand? Yes.
I
okay,
see
good.
Billy.
Okay. Okay, yeah, okay. So is anyone opposed to calling the question? Oh, wait, sorry, Felice. Is anyone, okay, let's lower all the hands. Is anybody opposed to calling the question? No, okay, so let's vote. So anybody, or let me, sorry, turn it over to Rebecca.
This is a motion to table the resolution from the zoning and development committee.
No, it's Elaine's motion in this meeting.
Her motion was to bring the resolution to the floor.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Okay.
Okay. So if you'd like to vote no on tabling, abstain, or not vote for cause, please raise your hand. Seeing none, the motion is tabled unanimously.
Okay, before we wrap here, I just want to say thank you very much, Annie, for sticking with us for so long and answering all the questions, and for the presentation. I really appreciate it, and I think it was very helpful. And you know, we appreciate your going above and beyond to stay with us. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me here. I really do appreciate you all taking so much time out of your evening to talk to me about comprehensive planning. It's really important, and I appreciate you taking so much time on it. So thank you.
If there are follow-up questions, are we able to submit those to you in writing? I mean, is that?
Yeah, you can send me an email. Okay, that's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Valerie.
Okay. I'm going to interpret all those as seconds, and it looks like we are going to adjourn. So thank you, everybody, very much for sticking with us here.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.